They have predicted all of the celebrities that will die in 2020. They even predicted the dates of these people, and they got them all right.
Oh, they got the date right. Oh my fucking god, that's the part that really fucks me up.
Listen, bro, they do much more than predict deaths out here. Like, people don't just die unexpectedly. And I think these people got something to do with it.
This is not a game. This is not a hoax. We're taking this seriously.
So what I'm assuming happened is that instead of saying July, they had every month appear. And then for the month that they got wrong, they edited out with YouTube's editor.
Then did 2020 Vision upload a metric ton of videos with random celebrities and dates?
It would take forever. The amount of guesses that he would have to make, it doesn't make sense.
Now, who would do such a thing?
Who's that Pokemon?
It's 2020 Vision.
2020 Vision.
2020 Vision. Vision 2020.
2020 Vision.
2020 Vision.
Vision 2020. 2020 Vision.
2020 Vision.
2020 Vision?
Has anyone ever thought that maybe the guy's just accurate?
No.
Nah, that's ridiculous. Never.
Hello. My name's Kai. I'm a filmmaker. This is my YouTube channel. I'm also an artist. I've got my Instagram linked down below, and I'm the face of 2020 Vision.
So that was 2020 Vision. And he's going to be joining us today to discuss the morality of what he's done and whether it was a good or bad thing. So, yeah, we're going to get into it. I'm actually on call with Kai right now, and we're going to have a discussion, hopefully a very productive one, on whether it was the right or wrong thing to do, and also the moral nuance to things of this nature, whether you're profiting from someone's death, whether it's valuable to society, and all of the good stuff in between. And I'll be linking that channel down below, the face reveal channel, the channel that he actually uploads to now. So I will be linking that as well. So, hello Kai. Can you hear us?
Hello.
Hello. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Wait, because I've just... I was just watching the live stream, and then it's like lagging behind, and then you popped up, and I was like, oh, what? Anyway, my name's Kai. I predicted a bunch of celebrity deaths, and everyone's telling me that what I did was immoral, and I just wanted to see what a moral philosopher would have to say about that.
So I don't know if it's just because I was saying before, I like the spooky stuff, but I actually think that it was not immoral. I think that there is moral nuance to it. I think that there is things that you've done that were questionable, especially in relation to the families of the people who obviously you've predicted the deaths of, who obviously they had died anyway. But it's making a spectacle out of their deaths, and I think that is perhaps where the moral nuance comes in. So, what would you say was the biggest criticism you've received so far? Echo.
The biggest one was that I'm disrespecting the dead and the families of the dead, but also that I'm profiting from fear and death. Those were the sort of main ones that I got.
So that you are profiting from fear and death, and you are disrespectful to the families.
Yeah.
What about to the individuals who died themselves?
Yeah, disrespecting. People were saying I was disrespectful to them as well, but I think that's sort of less of a strong argument, I suppose, because
they're dead.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't hear. What did you just say?
But yeah, I could imagine. So it was usually that you disrespected the family, and that you are profiting from fear and death. Now,
yeah,
I wonder if many people would say this about the news. Like the news profits from fear and death all the time. Like just off the top of my head.
Well, I did have a little talk with in the comments. Someone said that what I did was immoral, and I sort of asked them what was immoral about it, and they said, "Oh, because you're profiting from death." And I said, like, if a news station were to cover someone's death after they died, would that be immoral? And he said, "Yeah, if they just comment saying this person died on this day and saying how they died, then that wouldn't be immoral. But if they talked about anything else, then that would be immoral." And so I was like, what? So if Michael Jackson, when he died, news stations, they go out and they make stories on not only his death, but his life and his music and his legacy, also some of the controversies. And he was like, yeah, that's immoral. So I mean, I don't know if he was just biting the bullet on like a. I find that a bit ridiculous, but
so do I. So do I. I think that.
Yeah.
I don't think that there is something inherently wrong in profiting from fear and death. It's when you actively cause harm to another. And I think when we talk about morality, we want to talk about what the foundations of morality are and why something is right or wrong, rather than just, pointing towards something like a cultural trope, especially with the sense that like an individual. So for example, like one of the first things that came to my mind when I saw this was the families of the individuals. Like maybe you've not just caused them disrespect, but you've caused them maybe some genuine harm, like some like they feel that the memory of that loved one has been damaged or darkened in some way. And sorry.
Yeah. Oh, I was just thinking, like, if they were to watch the video and that would remind them about the death, maybe that would upset them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if I really think that would make it even more immoral, but there's something to think about as well.
Well, I think that like the first thing, like obviously reminding of the death, but I think what kind of came into my mind as just the first overall thing is that the spectacle that you kind of made around the deaths. You weren't really the first one to make the spectacle, were you? That's the issue. The spectacle was their lives. You've picked celebrities. You've not just picked random everyday individuals, waited for them to die, and then when I predicted their deaths. You've picked people who are cultural icons. So their lives and their deaths were already a spectacle for society. And I think So
you think it would be worse if I was just like John Smith down the road? He's going to die on Tuesday.
Possibly, because I think that like people they wouldn't understand why you're making this video. They wouldn't be expecting. There would be no anticipation. But I think when you know that your family member's a celebrity and they die, that there's going to be some sort of spectacle around their death. But obviously the nature of the spectacle was one of mystery and obviously cult leadership. Do you want to talk about what you did with the cult? Or like the Discord.
I started a cult.
Just casual. I started a cult. Yes, I started a death cult, man.
Yeah, well, the more like sort of casually you say it, the more it freaks people out. So I call it a death cult because it's sort of surrounding death, and I don't actually know what a death cult is. Do other cults call themselves? I don't know, but so basically, it was just I started doing all of these puzzles, because at this time everyone was like didn't know who I was. It was a big mystery. How did I do it? And so I started doing all these puzzles, and people had to solve these puzzles, and sort of started this little community around puzzle solving and on Discord. And right at the end of it, it was like 4 months worth of puzzles. There was like 40 puzzles as well in total, and it took me ages, like spending all day working on new puzzles and setting them up and stuff. And then right at the end of it, the final reveal was like how I did it. So I came clean in the end. But
I'm not gonna lie, I looked at some of the puzzles and they were really quite complex. Like they weren't like easy puzzles. Like I had a quick look. Like I watched that video that you made, like the one that I just played the start of, and even in that video there was some pretty complex puzzles. I mean, like I'm not gonna lie, I don't think I could have solved them. Like, to be entirely honest with you, so like even just
some of them did take them ages to solve. So some of them were like months before they actually solved it.
Well, I'm impressed. I'm impressed with like the amount of work that you put into it, and obviously there is an aspect of entertainment that this is sort of brought around. Like you've not only it's not just you're entertaining people by bringing the death to the forefront. Now, as I say, I think that like the harm done from bringing celebrity deaths and making a spectacle out of it is very minimal, considering that celebrity deaths are already spectacles. But then you even moved away from their identities. You didn't make it about them. You didn't tie it into who they are and their lives and so on. You moved it into a narrative, and that narrative was one of being a death cult leader who was a time traveler who was going to turn everyone into monkeys. This is I found that quite funny for one, and like obviously almost like a spoof. And And I think that that actually was a positive
I treated
aspect
it all as one big joke, pretty much.
Yeah, exactly. I think that it was. I think that it's a positive thing because it added almost an air of comedy. And I think that if we can't have, I think comedy at the points of death is very important. I think at these times you can either laugh or cry. I think there's a very small line that divides tragedy and comedy. A wedding. And I think that this is it's about the how you cope with the human experience. And I think death in this scenario is it's the word I'm looking for. It's a fragile matter. Like it's delicate. You've got to deal with it so you can either deal with it very delicately, or you can be very respectful, or you can take the absolute piss out of it, and that might even be better because it forces people to maybe overcome their own existential fears. And the existentiality of this death cult is what I thought was the most interesting. So although I do see the political nuance of,
What do you mean by that?
So this is the thing. Like, I think that the best thing that you did was you created a cult which was based on misdirection to reveal that it was all a lie. That there was no prediction. It was all fake. And what you forced people to do there is question what they would consider to be evidence. And I, as a philosopher, can't think of a greater learning experience than being forced to question what is epistemically the foundation of reality. Because this is and this is where if I was relating it to someone, it would be Heidegger, and Heidegger's all about death. So we can talk about that. So anyway, continue. Sorry.
When you say questioning I can't remember the exact word, the epistemic reality, did you say, of it?
Foundations of reality.
Are you? Yeah. The way that I see it is that it's more like it's making people question sort of what they believe on the internet and what counts as evidence and that kind of thing. But the epistemic reality of it, doesn't that sort of suggest more that you're talking about what really is true rather than the evidence that points to whatever's true?
Well, when I say like epistemic foundations of that reality, what I mean is that everyone's reality and everyone's reality is really constructed from their notions of cognitive success. Everyone seems to have an idea of what knowledge is without ever having studied what knowledge is, without ever having questioned what knowledge is. What is truth? If we were to say, like, is it true justified belief? Is it something which is, falsifiable? Like in terms of there are competing theories of truth. But the average everyday person doesn't even know what that there are these competing theories of truth. They don't even know that when we look towards what knowledge is, it is usually assumed. And it's assumed in relation to a narrative.
So are you talking about my knowledge that people will die? Is that what you're referring to? Or are you referring to the viewer's knowledge that I'm telling that I am real?
Well, this is the thing. I think that there's a few things. I think there's people who it's forcing people to question whether they should believe what they hear on the internet, in general. And I think that's the most general lesson that could be learned from this.
It's quite simple to understand.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of people, like, whether it's, with something like this, it's highly controversial. It's something where you kind of expect it to be a lie, but then that air of mystery makes you want it to be true. It adds excitement. It relinquishes our boredom. But in feeling that, in that feeling, is that not comparable to almost every political streamer concocting whatever theory that is most able to sell to their audience? What comes to mind is how many both right and left wing streamers say what is politically advantageous to get their audience motivated and talking in their streams. And what this this to me is, I think, using a form of entertainment to bring almost the spectacle of YouTube and of the media to the forefront of people's lives, to realize, look, this is all a display. Like this was a very like complex, concocted, well structured, and elaborate hoax, but it's no more of a hoax than everything else on YouTube.
Okay, well, I didn't really think about it like that. I suppose the difference is if there is like a political YouTuber who's out there saying, I don't know, that the votes, there's voter fraud and all of these votes are fake and blah blah blah, and they like, even if they really believe that, the difference is I came out at the end and said no, it's all fake. So I came clean at the end, whereas someone who's saying those kinds of things probably isn't going to, months later come out and say, oh yeah, what I said back then, that's not true.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly why I think that I like this. If you had stayed silent, and you had made it out like it was real, and you had actually started a death cult, and perhaps planted some sort of self-serving seeds into people's minds and manipulated the vulnerable.
I could have done that.
You could have done that. That's the thing, that you had that, like you had that possibility. Like people were.
I did seriously consider doing that at one point.
But like it's possible. Like you could have done that, but you didn't, and that's the real. I think that's the mark that differentiates you between the rhetorician and the con artist, and the comedian. I think
right. So now we're talking about. Oh yeah, carry on.
I was just going to say, like what comes to mind is essentially the separation between the philosopher and the sophist, or the doxophilist, right? So in ancient Greece,
doxophilist, what's that mean?
The lover of opinion. So if a philosopher is a lover of wisdom, doxophilist is a lover of opinion. It's a term that Plato uses in order to separate those people who don't see the difference between like justified true belief and opinion and belief. And
okay.
And I think the point of coming out in going, look, this is all a hoax, is you're saying like, look, there are truth conditions from which, if some people have managed to even work out how I did this hoax. And like, there is a truth behind this. Now, if you had said like, look, the truth is only but a currency and all that matters is my own political gain. Now that's a sophist. That's what they did. They would rhetorically convince large crowds of individuals to endorse them over people who are qualified in their subjects, in their skills, with skill sets, and they would use it to manipulate for their own political advantage. Now, that kind of individual is a real cult leader. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay. So would you... So we're not talking now about the morality of predicting deaths. Now we're talking about the morality of just sort of manipulating people, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Like
so if I did come out as like a real cult leader and I said it's all real, that wouldn't change the morality of like predicting celebrity deaths, would it? It's now that I've done something else which is immoral.
Well, I think that it would, in the sense that it would add something to the deaths, namely that the spectacle itself would become like tied up with their lives and their deaths in the memory of that individual. So you'd have to go, like, it depends on what you were saying necessarily about their deaths, and whether that was causing some sort of, let's say you were like, all right, the reason I was able to predict these people's deaths is because they were all in on this cult, and we've been doing this for the last 50 years, and then and you made an elaborate like scheme of it, not considering the interests of the family and so on like that, but instead you moved it towards a narrative, and at the end of that narrative you revealed it to be just a narrative. And I think that's what changed talking about deaths. The news has to be very respectful when they talk about deaths, primarily because they're just reporting the facts. Comedians, for example, usually aren't so respectful, and we don't necessarily judge them for it, because we expect that kind of engagement from a comedian, because it's challenging our own existential fear, and it's also challenging the cultural norms and conventions around death. And I think that's part and parcel with what you've done here. The cult itself has if it had have been like a genuine cult and you would have been motivating and manipulating people and causing harm to people who are alive and also desecrating the memories of those who are dead, I would see this as a wholeheartedly unethical endeavor. I'd be like, this is just wrong. What you're doing here is it's manipulative, but it's also disrespectful. Now, what you've done is you've taken real life events. Deaths do happen, and that's just the way that we're going to have to, deal with human existence. You've taken real life events, and you've spun a narrative around it, and then you've revealed it to be a narrative. If someone writes about someone's real death, like in a book, I don't think that it's necessarily unethical, so long as they reveal that this is just a narrative. It's not the case. It's not like, if someone wrote a conspiracy theory about, I don't know, an ex-president's death actually being, I don't know, an assassination, and then it goes on to a spy thriller. I don't think that person's wrong for doing that. And I don't think that they've desecrated the memory of that individual, because all they're doing is building a fiction from a factual standpoint, which I think all fiction, to be entirely honest with you, has some foundation in.
Okay, so what's confusing me about this is it sort of suggests that up until the moment that I came clean right at the end and said this is all fake, so up until that moment, what I did was sort of maybe not moral, and then as soon as I said, yeah, this is fake, suddenly it became not immoral. I don't know if you could call it moral, but is that what you mean? It was like that was a deciding factor. So before I announced anything, it wasn't moral.
Well, I think this is the way, this is the structure of narratives, right? So, people don't think in acts. They don't think in acts. They don't think in events. They think in narratives. We think in a way in which we can judge the holistic view of something. When it was occurring, we're halfway through the song. I don't know if it's a good or a bad song yet. I'm only halfway through. What I've heard might be good or bad, but then it might change and modify itself depending upon the notes that I've already heard, the notes that I'm experiencing, and the notes that I'm anticipating. The experience of a narrative is a stage of becoming. It has motion. It's transient. It's transitory rather. You move through the narrative, and when the narrative's completed, you can judge the holistic picture. And I think that, I have the benefit here of seeing this after it's happened. People who are seeing it as it's happening, obviously, they may be feeling something entirely different. They may be feeling, a greater amount of fear, or a greater amount of, or like disrespect from this. But at the end of the day, like sometimes, a good narrative, sometimes hurts with. Sometimes you've got to make people feel uncomfortable in order to produce, to be honest, positive effects.
Okay. So it sounds like you're kind of going the utilitarian route with this, saying that like there's the good outweighs the negative from what I did.
Well, I think...
Is that what you're going for?
I think that it's not necessarily even utilitarian as much as... I'm not a utilitarian, so I'm a deontologist. I think that we can look at the consequences, but we can also look at the motivations for why you're doing this, and also what it does bring to people's lives. I think that, like, if I was to ask you what, it is important, I suppose. What were the motivations for why you've done this?
I just did it because I don't know. Like I found this quirk of YouTube that allowed me to edit the videos afterwards, and I thought, there's got to be a good like hoax I can do with this. I mean, that was kind of the first thought that came to my head when I discovered it, and then I found that no one had done it before. So, if no one's done it before, then I might as well be the first person to do it. That was literally it. I didn't really put much thought into like, oh, I'm doing this because of this reason or because of that reason.
Purpose, yeah.
Because no one had done it before, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it is serendipitous that I think that there is a purpose, like a valuable lesson to be learned from this. And like, what I think you even mentioned in the video, you said like, in the video you made, like, people were, for those of you that were expecting this to come out and this all be real, like, maybe question what you learn, what you hear on the internet.
Yeah.
When did you decide to make sure that you weren't going to make this a real death cult and actually come clean about this?
Well, when I started it, when I created the Discord server, that was that was a few months before anyone had found the YouTube channel yet, so it was just an empty server. And I did it sort of thinking that if it does go viral, then there will be some somewhere to keep the momentum, so there'll be some social media that people can go on, and I can decide later what I'm going to do with it. So I created the Discord server, said it was a cult, and I just left it at that. And then when people did start joining it, suddenly I had this decision that you were talking about. Am I going to keep this up and pretend this is a real cult, or like what am I going to do? And so I didn't want to right at the start say, oh no, this is all fake, it's not real. But at the same time, I didn't want to mislead people into thinking it was a real cult. So that's why I started all this I was very sarcastic in the way that I spoke to people, and I made loads of jokes, and then I started going on about returning humanity to monkey and stuff, just so people might get the idea that I wasn't taking it so seriously.
Yeah.
But those first few weeks, there were people in there who I reckon I could legitimately have started a cult, and they would have been loyal followers. There were some seriously dedicated people in in the beginning, which was a little bit worrying for me. That did concern me a little bit. I could actually have, if it was anyone else, they might have actually have started the death cult at that point.
Well, that's the thing. I think to be entirely honest with you, I think the decision you made was the right one.
Yeah.
I think if you had went the other way, we would be having a very different conversation. Now you'd be like, well, should I have got all those people to kill themselves and for the rapture? well, I don't think so, Kai. But at the same time, like with the decision that you made, it seems to be like almost an elaborate political experiment. Or like political, like almost like it reminds me of something like an exhibition in a museum, or a gallery, that's meant to like evoke an emotional reaction within the population, precisely for the fact that it's breaking the norm. Something like even like in the Dada movement or something like that. And then I think it's evolved into something where you're like, look, all right, okay, so I've done this now. Where should I take it? And then you've spun a narrative on it to go like, look, please don't kill yourself over this or something, and then resolved it in a way that has, I think, overall positive consequences. Do I think that? I think this is why I would say that it's overall better, and then why I take an existential route is why I think this has been an overall positive experience, because anyone who is engaged with this, it's forced them to approach death in perhaps a different way. And one of the things that is I think important is, and this is the Heideggerian standpoint, is how our society approaches death. A society approaches death as a spectacle, but it's always something absent. Death is never like an actual possibility. We just witness deaths and happen all the time. We hear them on the news. Loved ones die maybe, or somebody else's families die, and it's like, oh my god, that's so tragic, let's move on, or oh my god, what a piece of drama, and we don't actually consider our own deaths. And this is the Heideggerian point, the possibility of impossibility.
I don't really know what you mean by that. Lots of people consider their own deaths. It's one of the
like
big
suicidal,
things that people are scared of.
But but this is the thing. Like the fear is what leads people into the spectacle for Heidegger. So people start doing things that are inauthentic. The follow cults. They go into cults, for example. They join cults, or the even just become more politically active in certain forms of dogmatism. They might even just fall into routes of escapism. They might just consume products and so on like that, to avoid contemplating the finitude of their own existence. What would the world be when I'm gone? Like the reality of the situation is that I won't have any. Actually, the possibility of impossibility is how Heidegger describes it. The point in which there is no me, and there is nothing that I can do in the world, and all is nothing. And it's like this ultimatum, this ultimate self-destruction, which an individual can
so
realize.
when was Heidegger around?
Heidegger was a Nazi, so he was around the 1930s, 1940s, but before that as well. But the book that I'm referencing is actually being in time before he was a Nazi. And the tragic thing actually about this is the book was actually dedicated to Husserl, who, you know, and I spoke in the terms of narrative there, and I said that anticipation of the notes to come. That was actually Husserl. That was his mentor. This is what's called phenomenology. And Heidegger was basically the grandfather of existentialism. And it's best to divorce the man from his arguments, because I think the man turns his character. I think of him as a horrible human being, and I'm glad he's dead. But the arguments that he presented have been influential to existentialists all over the world. So, for example, Jean-Paul Sartre attributed almost his entire work to basically being built off Heidegger.
Could you give like a really brief explanation of what existentialism is?
Yeah, so existentialism is the belief that, and like the foundation of the metaphysical foundation of reality is existence, conscious existence. So we wouldn't say you can't talk about something prior to mind, and this might seem like quite counterintuitive to people who, you know, if you take a scientific approach to reality, for example, which I do, by the way.
Yeah.
I'm not anti-science. I'm very much pro-science. People like to say that minds are deterministic from nature. The brain produces the mind. Existentialism is a challenge to that. The questions that are asked from the existentialist position is essentially what this is. It's always existence. It's existence before essence. So existence is what allows us to construct and create, understand, like modes of meaning and being and ways of understanding the world. And through this, then we can start talking about things like science and religion and so on like that. And these are modes of human understanding, epistemological fields that are metaphysically dependent upon our engagement and our decisions. And it's not to say that science hasn't got any foundation, because most existentialists would not, many existentialists like myself, I wouldn't dismiss something like astrophysics or something. You know, I'm not crazy. But the understanding that one of the key components to reality is mind, and understanding how mind impacts our understanding of the world. So this is where you hear of a field, a field called phenomenology, which is the science of perception. You know, how much of the object is me and how much of the object is itself. You know, Jean-Paul Sartre talked about how the walls were nauseating, for example, and he realized that the walls themselves were actually impacting him like that because he was projecting and experiencing an object which caused him nausea.
Right, so this is... I don't know much about philosophy at all, so I'm finding this quite hard to follow. But from what I'm kind of gathering, this does seem like different to like what I would have thought that you would have said, right? Because this sounds quite... I don't know, is postmodern the right word? It's sort of like...
The postmoderns were very much influenced by existentialists. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, because I quite like the idea that we should look in the world as though that like things do actually have real physical properties, right?
So do I.
So I don't think a wall is nauseating. If you think that the door is nauseating, maybe then the mental image you've created of the wall is nauseating. But I don't think it's fair or right to say that the wall is nauseating.
Well, I mean, we can get into this a little bit. So for example, most people like who take the sort of physicalist approach usually defends something like, I don't know, like empiricist theories of truth, and knowledge. Like knowledge is produced from empirical analysis, right? And there's some arguments against this. So
Yeah.
George Berkeley, for example, 17th century bishop, took empiricism and turned it on its head. He's like, look, if all of reality is based off sense experience, and my engagement into reality, in the physical world, is based off sense experience, then because I use sense organs to interpret the world exists as a mental image within my mind, and I'm never in contact with the world. I'm only in contact with a mental image of the world. And that is, like, you know,
I can agree with that.
Yeah, you see, but that causes a form of idealism. The world is a construct of ideas, and then.
But there is still a real wall out there. Like you've got the mental image of the wall that you've created, which might be nauseating, but there is an actual wall there that does actually exist, and that wall, I don't really see how you can describe that as being nauseating.
Well, here's the thing. So. How on what the reason that we have to believe that a wall exists is because of our sense perception. Can our sense perception be wrong?
Yeah.
So if we go like the Cartesian route, can I trust these? Why should I trust my hands in front of me? Why should I say that they exist? This could be a dream.
Yeah. Well, it's. I mean, I don't really know much about this kind of thing, but I think within science you do have to make assumptions like that the material world actually exists, and especially when we're talking about science, you've also got sort of repeatability and that kind of thing. So if like you always walk into a wall and you always crash into it and can't get through it, then you can quite safely make the assumption that wall is there.
That could be a brain in a vat, right? And this could
but I suppose at the end of the day, you've got to make some kind of like assumption. But even if you are a brain in a vat,
I agree in some respects.
Then, yeah, well, I suppose if you are a brain in a vat, then there is no wall in the first place. So I suppose in that case, you could say the wall is nauseating because all that exists about the wall is what's in your own brain in the vat. But So I suppose is what you're saying that this all just comes down to whether or not I have faith that I'm not a brain in a vat?
Well, no. I mean, like, I'm not a Cartesian, right? And that would be a Cartesian argument. Like, I think therefore I am. Like, the what I am is a thinking thing, and that's all I have as the foundation of reality, and I'm going to build it up from there. And then he uses God, and I'm not going to do any of that. So, that was one argument. Essentially, that's one like way of going down to. Like doubting material existence. And one of the most embarrassing things, you know, it was a very big embarrassment for philosophy for hundreds of years, was that we never managed to prove the existence of an external world. And it's obviously, you know, in terms of the field, that's the one that's supposed to prove the existence of the external world. It seems like the skeptical arguments were stronger than the positive arguments. And you know, it gets worse. So let's say if we accept, let's say, empiricism again, and we'll go down, let's say, the position of Humean. So Hume, have you ever heard of the problem of induction?
No.
So essentially, Hume's like, why should we believe in causation? Like this guy believes, like, he believes in like the material existence of reality. He believes in empiricism. So he says, well, let's say there is a snooker table and I see one billiard ball hit another. It's like I see event A, you know, the ball be struck, and then I see the second ball be struck, but I do not see a third term betwixt them. So he sees one ball move and then he sees another ball move, but he doesn't see the cause. So why should he believe that there is a cause?
Right.
We always see, and this is
Wait, who is it saying this? Hume?
Hume, yeah. This is what's called the problem of induction.
So he says that... Wait, so he can see one snooker ball move, and then he can see another snooker ball move, but he doesn't think... He can't see that the first ball caused the second ball to move.
Well, he can't see a cause. Like the whole thing is that a cause...
Wait, when was this guy around? When was this guy around?
1800s. Actually, 1700s.
Okay, so... Oh right, so like was that before like Newton and his laws of physics?
No, this was Newton.
Laws of motion.
This was actually in response to Newton.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know. Like, I suppose, like the way I see it, you look at what Newton wrote, and it matches up with what we see in the real world. So I feel like it's safe to assume that that's the cause. Like, we can see the cause in Newton's laws.
You say
right?
this is an assumption. Again, he would agree. You'd just be like, all right, but you've just assumed that, and then it's induced. We are inducing a cause. We are assuming that causation.
So yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's a very safe assumption though. Like I'm not a philosopher or anything, so maybe
I'm gonna make the argument against Hume in a second, and this is where phenomenology comes in.
Yeah.
So Hume, like the argument against Hume, is from Immanuel Kant, and it was the transcendental analytic or the transcendental deduction, right? So Kant, Hume's fork, as it's called, separated the world into two separate categories. That which is a priori and that which is synthetic. Synthetic is something which is experienced. A priori is something which is analytic, true by definition. And so something like Newton's laws of motion would have been a priori, forms of mathematical relations of ideas, as he would call it, relations of ideas, whilst synthetic would be the movements of bodies that we can see in the world. Now, Hume in this basically creates a fork between the a priori and the synthetic. The a priori's engagement with the synthetic is only assumed. There's no reason to actually say that like these relationships of ideas are explanations of the world. We have abstracted ideas from the world, related them together, and use them to explain engagements in the world. But this is overall an inductive process. It's an assumed process. There's nothing necessary about it. An individual could turn around and go, well, actually, I don't agree with that. Well, Kant says absolutely not. He's he goes like, look, this is the a priori and the synthetic can be united in what he calls an a priori synthetic proposition. And one of the things he talks about is causation, space and time. And he says that a necessary component for an experience at all is the application of a concept to the physical world or to the material world so that it is understandable. So, for example, he points out space and time. An individual would not be able to create a distinction between the external and internal experience necessary so that they could differentiate objects and themselves within the world. They wouldn't be able to operate within a spatio-temporal framework, and so they wouldn't be able to gain any knowledge at all to even create these relationships of ideas. So he says that look, we've already applied, the mind already applies space, time, and what he calls the unity of apperception, the unity of the subject. This is all happening somewhere to someone, which is how it's understandable. And this is what he considers necessary. So to have an experience at all, Kant would say that these concepts have already been applied. They are already, to say that there is, and they are proven in our experience. And an example he gives is something like mathematics. So when we go like 1 + 1 = 2, Hume would see that as a tautology. Basically, we have wrote 2 and 2 separately on each side. So we're basically saying 2 = 2 because it's an equation. It's an equivalence.
Yeah.
Whilst Kant says no, it is not the same thing. It's a tautology, but there is a separation between 1 + 1 = 2. And it is the time taken to actually do the sum. To let's say, like, if I was to do like 5 × 25, and I come out and say like, what is that? That's 125. Yeah. And
okay.
The time taken for me to do the sum has created a separation between the original, the way it is written, like 5 × 25 and 125, and that is what makes it a priori synthetic. It is true by definition, but it's only proven true through experience. And that's where Newton's laws of motion come in. It's like,
okay. Oh, that's quite interesting.
And yeah, so I'm very much on the side of that. So when I sound like I'm an existentialist and I'm saying like it's all an aspect of mind, it's only because I would argue that mind is necessary for any knowledge of the world and an experience of the world. So when I'm saying it all boils down to mind, it's about testing how much of our reasoning and our mind has changed and modified objects. So that we can see like the distance we have from truth and from the object itself.
Okay, so can I try to get this straight? So 5 times 5 and 25, if we're talking about purely mathematical, logical, what do these represent? They do represent the same thing. But in order for us to understand what those things mean, we have to, do a translation in our head, like calculate what 5 times 5 is. And so that is that sort of calculation that we do is what connects the sort of logical, like real concept of the numbers with how we experience them. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. A more tangible way of doing this is with like the hypotenuse of a triangle. Like the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. It's very well nice to say that like that's a geometrical fact. But the only way it becomes a fact is having two points separated between space, and space is experiential. It's something we experience. And so once we plot 2 points, we can find that actually, yes, this is true. 2 points, the distance between a straight line is always and this is assuming, I think, like Euclidean geometry, but the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, and it's provable in that sense.
Well, I'm finding this difficult to. So I hope you can keep up with me, because my brain is working quite slowly through this. But I don't really sort of understand. I mean, this is all very interesting stuff, but I don't really understand how that solves this issue of how do I know I'm not a brain in a vat?
Well, that doesn't necessarily solve the. I mean, like they can't literally just like. He has to say that we must assume reason. So what happens is that
because we have to assume reasons for everything that we do, even if it's when we're considering like the logical truth of like 5 times 5 equals 25. Even that we have to sort of put our own experience to it. I mean, that kind of sounds like it's just dodging the question, though. Surely,
this is his response to Hume. His response to Descartes is worse. So. Descartes, I know you probably know the famous like cogito ergo sum. I think therefore I am. I think therefore I am at the end of Cartesian doubt. The end of this position is this point in which like the only thing that I can know is that there is a thinking thing, right? And he says that he himself is that thinking thing. He goes on to argue that he must exist in some form. What Kant says, like, actually, I think, therefore I am, is just you're actually assuming psychological continuity. There's no reason to assume the existence of the I. He's like, that's circular. Really, you could sum it up as am or existence, that there is something thinking which is maybe disembodied and non-continuous. Right. And this is just an abstraction from it or something from it. So he just makes it worse. And he says, look, you just end up in a whirlpool. And he's like, and then like, look, the reason that he ends in this scenario, he says, look, this is where you end up without reason. If we say that everything is questionable, then you end up in this scenario. But I think the best way to come out of this is just to say the skeptical argument, the ultimate skeptical argument, global skepticism as it's called, relies upon a normative framework. It relies upon a form of reason to actually function as an argument itself. So it's actually presupposing reason to function in the first place. So you can't dismiss reason, because if you dismiss reason, then you dismiss the argument you've just used to dismiss reason. and so it's self-defeating. This is where someone like Wittgenstein would say, like, look, logic, it can't be dismissed because it's the way you think. You'd actually be trying to convince yourself to not think. You're trying to talk yourself out of words.
I mean, this sounds exactly the same though to me as you have to make assumptions that we're not a brain in a vat. Though I mean, those arguments sound the same thing. Like you have to make the assumption that your brain isn't you're not a brain in a vat, and you also have to make the assumption that logic exists and is a useful tool in reasoning.
The difference between, like, this is the thing with the brain in the vat position and the reason is the indubitability of logic. It can't be doubted because the way that you would doubt it is through the use of logic. And Aristotle made this point in Book Gamma, I think, in terms of trying to deny the law of non-contradiction.
Isn't that circular though?
Well, it's circular, but it's in the sense that it's like, for example, something being circular doesn't necessarily mean it's false. It can be true, which is what a tautology is. Something which is tautological. So if I was to say 1 equals 1, that would be true by definition. It can't be doubted. If I say 1 does not equal 1, well then 1 ceases to function. So it's more of the fact that it's necessary. It's like if you were to try and say, if you're trying to come up with any argument, it's this is the difference between what is called sufficient reason and like sufficient grounding and necessary grounding. Something being like essentially undoubtable means that it is, we must assume it to be, it is true. There is no way to argue against it being false. So it's not as pleasant as sufficient reason, where you can give, a prior cause, because like, it's like, look at it like this. It's like, if logic is logic is the ground from which everything else is built. So if you try to dismiss logic itself, then you essentially, by whatever you've built on top of it, falls out anyway. So it's indubitable.
Yeah.
It's just the way it will end up.
I don't know. It still just sounds to me like you're just making assumptions, though, which I'm fine with. I think that's great, but it doesn't sound like any different of an argument.
It's necessary. I mean, I think that the difference between just a random assumption is the necessity of it. It's like, so for example, if I was to assume that the world is made of glass, versus assuming logic is that I can get away without assuming. Like, I could make an argument that the world is not made of glass. I could not make an argument. An argument could never be made.
Wouldn't it also be necessary to assume that I'm not a brain in a vat?
No.
Why not?
What would be necessary about it?
Well, if I because I want to make the assumption, for example, that I can't walk through walls. If I want to know whether or not I can walk through walls, I have to make the assumption that the wall is actually there.
I'm
not just imagining it all.
Characters on video games can't walk through walls, man. Depending on how well the game is made.
Oh, right. So even like the internal logic of a brain in a vat might not be able to walk through walls because for some reason it imagines it can't.
Yeah, the way in which like this reality functions is dependent upon.
Okay.
So, now I think it would be rational to assume this is where, if like once we've assumed reason, then we can judge an argument being the probability of an argument being true or false, and then take the position there. And this is an argument that Galen Strawson makes. So he's like, you could imagine, like, if you've ever heard of solipsism, the belief that you're the only mind in existence.
Mm-hmm.
Like you actually can't disprove it. You can't say that there are definitely 100% other minds in existence, right? But he's like, well, why would we?
Is that like being formally disproved?
Yeah, like you can't formally disprove it. That's the.
Has it been proved that you can't formally disprove it?
Well, I don't think.
Oh, right. I don't know how philosophy works.
I don't think that I don't think that in the last few hundred years of people trying to disprove it, that we've actually managed to find anyone. I mean, we're always open to like suggestions if you have one.
No. I mean, I'm only asking because I don't really know how philosophy works. I know that in maths, for example, you can prove that there are infinite prime numbers. Like, you couldn't list all of the prime numbers, obviously, because they're infinite, but you can prove that there are infinite prime numbers. And so I'm just like, I don't really know how philosophy works. I was just asking whether or not it has been proved that you can't disprove solipsism, or whether or not it just hasn't been done yet.
Well, I mean, there are arguments against it, but then it depends on, like, obviously the philosophy that the individuals engaged in. Like, one of the things with philosophy is that many of us don't agree. And the thing is, it's like with like maths, it's kind of like maths is quite clean. With the way it's pure logical expression.
You have to agree with maths.
Yeah, like philosophy is more akin to something like science. Different competing theories show their utility, and then we'll have to, essentially base it off that, whether each theory is able to have more explanatory power or not. And so, like, in terms of being able to essentially disprove solipsism, the issue is that solipsism is like a skeptical argument, right? And it's just a point where you could just start, like, you could formulate it like, well, what if this is all, like, you can just keep adding abstractions. So you could go something like the physical world is a projection from your brain, and then someone could go, well, what about my understanding of, like, other people? Why should I dismiss other people? And, oh, well, they're a projection of your brain. And then you just keep going back, and it's just another, like, oh, well, you don't realize it, but that's just a projection of your brain. And, oh, your self-understanding is only an aspect of your brain, and it just keeps getting more and more ludicrous, to be entirely honest with you.
Yeah. I mean, it makes intuitive sense to me that you wouldn't be able to disprove solipsism. I was just wondering if there was a formal way of notating it, but yeah, I just don't really understand philosophy.
I think
much.
That's fair enough. I mean, like, obviously, I'm a continental philosopher, so I don't necessarily even engage in in the type. For example, I'm referencing Strawson, and the way he engages with problems is different to the way I engage with problems. And there's different fields and stuff within philosophy, different modes of argumentation, but all rely upon logic, a lot of the time natural language arguments, and reasoning, and we'll all rely upon like certain.
Well, because I have actually seen, I have seen like YouTube videos where they're explaining sort of epistemology or something, and they use things like, if P equals Q, then Q blah blah, and it kind of looks like maths. It's sort of using a similar formalized language to maths.
Yeah, that's analytics.
Is it?
So, like, analytic philosophy typically uses formal logic more. Although we do use like things like, for example, syllogisms were been around since like Aristotle. But that's like in epistemics. Yeah, we do sometimes use that. I think that analytic philosophers usually prefer formal logic, but then you end up in debates. Like, for example, the analytics even end up in debates about the meanings of words within formal logic and why they should accept certain meanings of words. There are only certain, like, for example, I would agree with something like modal logic, and like the laws within modal logic. So, for example, the necessitation law and stuff like that. That it must be necessarily possible, because otherwise it would be impossible, and so it can't be spoken of, and so on. Like, basically, you need to apply the classical laws of logic, and there seems to we're basically most of us come to the agreement that the classical laws of logic for the most part are correct. There's a few areas in which, when we fight over logic, where, for example, the law of non-contradiction, we'll fight over the law of non-contradiction a bit. Some people argue that the law of non-contradiction is not a law, that it can be broken. Some people argue that something cannot be itself and not itself at the same time.
Okay.
So, like, it cannot be itself and its contradiction at the same time. So, like, water can't be fire, or something like that. Or water could not be not water. Could not be. Yeah. Actually, I'll find the formal thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's
even
like you say, because it's all talking about language and stuff. So it seems a bit like I wouldn't even know where to begin trying to prove or disprove that.
It becomes more and more complex. So, like, Aristotle even within
no.
Aristotle, there's two interpretations of the law of non-contradiction. And
Okay.
and it just becomes essentially it becomes harder and harder each time. I actually think what is it? How does he? I'll see if I can find the way he puts it. Like the principle of non-contradiction is like usually like taken like it is impossible to suppose the same thing to be and not to be is one. There is it is opposite assertions cannot be true at the same time. There's another one, and I think there's another one which I can't remember. I'm not gonna be able to find it, and I'm not gonna bother looking it up. There's and then they get like there's like different ones, and there's like different formulations of the argument to try and nail it down more and more. And then you've got philosophers like Hegel who come along, and well, what about things that are like contradictions to be what they are?
Yeah.
And he says he points out like so being and nothing. And then he points out becoming. Becoming is a state in which something is and is not, what it is actually moving towards. And he uses this to resolve Meno's paradox. And this is honestly, like probably not where I expected to be in this conversation. like about deep epistemology.
No, yeah, like I'm getting very confused here. Can we talk more about moral philosophy then?
Yeah. So the reason that we ended up in this like sort of thing is just because when we talk about existentiality, when Heidegger talks about like meaning, and we talk about like, even in this scenario, it's like, what do we mean by the law of non-contradiction? What do we mean by like, when we're talking about scientific terms, what do we mean? What is an atom? What do we describe as the structures of language which we are attributing to objects in order to, investigate and explain them so that we can, better understand the world as it is. And even like modes of cognitive success, what do we describe as being, cognitive success and allowing for the accumulation of knowledge and so on like that. And what you come to realize in philosophy is that the mind is like our understanding of material objects is being conditioned by the mind for us to be able to understand them at all, for us to be able to essentially separate objects into like separate this is a table, that's a chair, blah blah blah. And that's an atom, that's an electron, and we do it based on certain characteristics and certain like properties, and those properties, and the reason that we'll do that is in relation to what we're trying to study. So we'll say like, well, physics is separating and demarcating objects relating to this criteria to try and understand the physical world in a better way. But the reason that physicists are doing that in the first place is because they're involved in an investigation which assumes that if we gain knowledge of the physical world, it will essentially reveal a notion of truth in terms of cognitive success. And so you find that actually it's all being spawned from the motivations of physicists just as much as it is from the investigative process. And like that's why we run stuff like double-blind placebo-controlled trials and in like things like medical trials. It's why we'll have peer review, we try to remove human bias as much as possible. But we don't usually try to remove the biases that we have, even involved in the field. So, a great example was anthropology, right? So feminist anthropologists came around. There was what was called the myth of the coy female, right? And they used to say that women didn't want sex as much as men, and that women were, less likely to have multiple sexual partners, while men would have more sexual partners. And they based this off observations from chimpanzees. And they said, look, if you look at female chimpanzees, they only, mate with one partner, and this is for, essentially reproductive purposes, while males will mate with many partners, right? Now, when female anthropologists started coming around, when women were being more educated and we started to challenge social norms, what we found is that these social norms were impacting the very way we were analyzing other species to even associate that species with ourselves. And actually, the females in chimpanzees were sleeping with multiple males, and it was way more obscure than what had made it out, and so it challenged the entire field of anthropology in that sense, and evolutionary biology, and the findings that they had.
I'm not sure I understand. Are you saying that we were projecting our own biases when studying the monkeys? So they assumed that female monkeys were less promiscuous, and so that influenced the way that they were observing them? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, like we were actually projecting our own bias onto the monkeys. On the chimps.
I mean, that doesn't surprise me.
No, it doesn't, does it? But these are the kind of things that, like, Heidegger's pointing out. We're all involved in what's he calls the idle talk. He says that before we form a self-consciousness, this is kind of more of a metaphysical point as well. Your understanding of self is actually a linguistic construction. You're actually applying norms and conventions, like a form of normativity, to understand your own mind and how you're engaging with reality. I mean, literally, we teach kids language, at a very young age, and if children emulate their parents, with the mirror stage and so on. And this is
what you were saying before. Oh yeah, sorry.
I was just saying this is essentially how we form self-consciousness. And so Heidegger sees this as a they self. We start as a they before we're an I. And the I is an expression of a group and cultural mentality. Sorry, you wanted to...
Yeah, it's just what you were saying before about the monkeys. And you mentioned double-blind studies. Isn't double-blind studies the whole point of them, that you don't have human bias? Like, how could you introduce human bias into a double-blind study?
That's what I was saying. I was saying that that's the purpose. That's why we do, because we know that we're capable of influencing the results.
Yeah.
But even what we accept.
I thought you were saying that.
Oh no! I'm very much in favor of double-blind placebo
control.
But this is why, like, even in the ways that we construct, like, the model of physics. We know that it's a model. It's an it's purely for explanatory purposes. It's not actually the physical bodies and how perfectly explained. This is the realization that what we're doing is just as much epistemically a construction based on certain sort of what Heidegger calls existentialia, but many people will say like axiomatic beliefs, things that we hold to be true. But for the field to sort of function, what I think in terms of when we talk about existential analysis is challenging asking the question, like, what is being, what is existence, and it forces us to question, the structures of meaning within our lives. It forces us to question the way in which we're approaching certain questions, modes of justification, the notions of truth, what we hold to be true. And so what I think that, and to do this, Heidegger says death is one of the best ways to do it. When you realize the finitude of your own existence, and you realize the possibility of impossibility, you're forced to take responsibility for the moments that you have. You realize that death is your own most possibility. No one can die your death for you, which reveals to you that no one can live your life for you either. And that the structures of meaning within your life are your responsibility and not the responsibility of your society. Your society is your responsibility as well. So, this is the realization that gets you out of watching Coronation Street and start actually questioning, why am I watching Coronation Street? And essentially that's what existential analysis is, and it's something that doesn't necessarily require you to be like in a university. You don't have to be some sort of like some like philosopher or anything like that to do it. You can just ask yourself, like, why am I living this way? What's the point in all of this? And start questioning the way that you're structuring your life. And why do I even think that? Why did I think this was true at all? For example, like, why did I think that this wasn't a hoax? And I think that's why I think that this has been an existential exercise, because if people did genuinely believe that it's true, they can question, like, wait a minute, why did I believe that this was true? And it gives you the opportunity to see your own limitations and the own, like, expressions of meaning that you've been perhaps projecting onto onto the videos and onto reality. You know, you're arguing with people. There's no way that it could be false. Why? But you can ask yourself, well, why did I want it to be true? And it starts a psychoanalytic, existential analysis within an individual where they start questioning who they are, what they're doing with their lives, and why they should, believe in certain things. You know, should I believe that there's a God or not? Like, these things are the essential questions of human experience. And I think that's where I would say the real value of what you did really come from.
Well, I never really thought about it like that. I mean, I suppose the idea that I want people to question what they believe on the internet was like, that did come out of it, but I never intended that to be the message or anything. So I hope that people do sort of get that from it, because now what you're saying here, I mean, yeah, like, it does sound like quite a valuable lesson. But I'm still getting, you know what's weird? I'm still getting messages on like Instagram, because the only way they could find my Instagram is through the face reveal video I did, where I explained how everything is. And I'm still getting messages on there saying, how did you do it? Tell me when I'll die. Hey, when will this person die? You know, so people, even though they've seen that video, still for some reason think that I'm actually psychic. I don't really understand it.
Well, I think that reveals more about them than it does about you. You know, like, or anything like that. It reveals, like, unfortunately.
But
like,
I do have a responsibility, don't you think?
100%. But I think your responsibility,
because
your responsibility is even just to turn around and go, like, no, seriously, it was a hoax. Have you ever thought about, you know, why you would want this to be true, kind of thing? You know, this is like the reality is, though, we all have our own responsibility to ourselves and to questioning ourselves. Like, you can't perform someone's existential analysis for them. You know, you can only tell them it was a hoax.
No.
And if they decide that they would rather believe a fiction than the truth, well, that's where we can move on to a conversation about madness, if you like.
Well, no, I still wanted to talk about morality, because, I mean, the thing is, like, I didn't I mentioned this like, sort of moral question that I was getting, like, was it immoral to predict deaths? I mean, the truth is, I never thought it was immoral, because, you know, I wouldn't have done it if I thought it was immoral. But I wanted to understand more about moral philosophy, not just this question, but just in general. So can we talk about, like, what you think morality is, and why how you can decide whether something is moral or not?
Okay, like, the thing is that morality as a field it's been going on for a long time. Like, in moral philosophy. And I'm very much involved in sort of the metaphysics and metaethical side of things. Why don't you tell me what you think morality is, and we'll go from there.
Okay. Well, I kind of I don't know. Maybe it's just like I come from, like, a more liberal area or something, but I always lived under the assumption that morality was subjective. You know, some people think this is right, some people think this is wrong, blah blah blah. You know, in the same way that, like, music is subjective.
Mm-hmm.
You know, some people like classical music, some people like jazz, but that's why I sort of saw it as a little bit of a shock when I found out that, you know, people like you, who were actually studying this stuff, were saying that morality is objective, because I always associated that with, like, religious people. You know, saying, like, God says this is moral, God says this isn't moral. And I'm not saying that, no, you're wrong, I'm right. Or I know that there's more I need to learn on this topic. And so, I mean, the more I've been looking into it, the harder I've found to even define what morality is.
That sounds about right.
I suppose there are things that I do sometimes which I feel guilty about afterwards, and I would say that those are
moral sense.
Immoral.
Yeah. See, I don't think moral sense tells you what's right or wrong. For example, people feel guilty from surviving a plane crash. Survivor's guilt.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, this just goes to show how little I really understand.
Well, it's complex. I mean, like, I'm not gonna lie. Like, this field's been going on, as I say, for about 2,000 years. So there is a load of arguments in this. You know, when
can I just say, like, it kind of, yeah.
Sorry.
It kind of feels like what we were going back to. We were talking about, like, maths. When we're talking about maths, you use the word clean to describe it. It's sort of we all have to agree on what numbers are. We all have to agree on what it means to add one number to another number. And after we've done all of that, then we can agree that yes, 2 + 2 = 4. But with morality, if we can't even agree on what it means, then how can it be objective?
That's the same thing with any other field. So like, look at it like this, right? With maths, the reason that we actually agree on maths being clean is because we've made so for example, in maths, you talk about axioms. And those axioms are the foundational beliefs from which maths is, essentially predicated on. So, for example, in most people will assume something like Euclidean geometry, and then people started proposing like different forms of geometry, like non-Euclidean geometry, in which there can be a square circle, and stuff like that. The reason that like most people think that subjects are clean is because they've never necessarily delved in, like say like physics, right? Our understanding of physics is based upon certain metaphysical assumptions which have never really been questioned, like what a material body is and how it functions and so on like that. But it adds utility to our lives, so we just sort of move along as if it's fine. We don't necessarily ask ourselves, "Oh, wait a minute, why do I believe the physical world exists at all?" That is essentially only for crazy people and philosophers. What's the difference, I guess? Like the reality of the situation is that any epistemological field, like any field which is trying to claim knowledge, like or truth at the end of it, like that there is something that we've actually learned that is a measure of cognitive success, where it's like, yes, we've done it, this is reality. I've absolutely explained reality here. We're doing it based off a certain set of assumptions. And those assumptions can either be grounded sufficiently or necessarily. And it all falls down to logic, which is why logic and like maths is just almost an expression of pure logic. It's like, that's why it's basically symbolic, the whole thing. It's like 1, 2, and then we'll just go through it as, but maths is like, in terms of having utility, is not negligible until we start talking about science, and the physical world. This is where like you move into like notions of truth and like what it means for something to be true, and how should we define anything. There's been like so in like terms of axioms, it's like, how do we define those axioms? What words should we use and why? What are the motivations to construct a signifier and the meaning behind a signifier? And what is the bedrock of language? Now, this is a massive debate in philosophy itself. Like for example, what is language, and how does it relate to reality? I mean, you got Wittgensteinians, for example, arguing that the world is language. Everything that we experience is language. The limits of the language are the limits of my limits. The limits of my language are the limits of my world. But that language is only self-referential. It actually doesn't come from anywhere. Language is a productive exercise in which an individual conceives of a mode of understanding, and that mode of understanding exists within a community which then engages in it. So the separation between religion and science is just one of conversation, one of a form of life in which one individual chooses one form of life over another, and there's no semantic grounding in reality. I'm against this, by the way. I will say that. But there are like arguments for that, and to be entirely honest with you, you'll find that the people arguing for the Wittgensteinian position are the people that'll be probably more sympathetic to even notions of to like a lot of what people would see as like common sense notions, right? Then you've got like empirical theories of truth, trying to ground truth as being abstracted from reality. Then you've got pragmatic theories of truth as an expression of explanatory power in relation to an endeavor that we're engaged in. The correspondence theories of truth. Truth is the accurate description of reality. Coherence theories of truth. The most probabilistic explanation of reality. There's quite a few different theories, right? So, and all of these hold bearing on every single subject in the world, not just ethics, right? So each form of investigation has its own normativity. So when we engage in ethics, we usually do actually agree on certain definitions. Like, we don't actually argue a lot of the time over what morality or ethics necessarily is. Like, we argue over maybe what good and bad are. A lot.
But, I mean,
sorry, continue.
Yeah. Earlier you mentioned meta ethics, and I thought that was the question on what morality is.
Yeah. So meta ethics
if
is,
there is a field of meta ethics, and
it's like questions about ethics.
Whereas you're saying now that we do have a shared definition of morality.
Well, I mean, like it's like, look, there's it's like kind of there's meta epistemology, there's metaphysics. We'll argue over everything. Well, I mean, like, we will, but like, right, and we'll like.
Okay, so what's your definition? What is the definition of morality then?
Well, it's so like, this is the thing. So a lot of the time when we're engaging these discussions, it's kind of like, let's say I was arguing for an empiricist position. You say I am arguing for an empiricist position, and I'm assuming that. Now it's the same thing with like, so I would make an argument in terms of metaphysics that from a phenomenological position, that there is a will, there is a subjective experience in which an individual is trying to achieve a given end, that there is an action urging process that exists within individuals from which they are trying to achieve some measure of experience. And so when I talk about something like morality, I look back towards the ancient Greeks. So morality etymologically comes from moralis, but people it became changed over time. So morality started being understood as an object. So like, you'd say like, well, what is morality? You're like, what is it? What is it? It's like, well, morality for the Greeks wasn't an is. It was more of like an adverb than a noun. You'd say it as like, good wouldn't be a noun, rather it'd be more of like an adverb. So you'd be like something is good at doing something. It'd be functional rather than being an object in itself, unless you're talking about like Plato, who believed in the form of the good. So like ethikos would mean like pertaining to behavior. And when we talk about behaviors, I would say that when we look to behaviors are done in relation to achieving a certain end. And the judgment around that end is done based around our experiences of positive and negative. Pain, pleasure, well-being and suffering, and our interpretation and our investigation into those. I'd say that we are constantly investigating those experiences. Like, as we have them, we compile more and we understand them more, and we relate them to our natures in many ways. I'm not one to argue for a human nature specifically, but we could say that, where I would argue that we are material beings who feel agonizing pain if we dip our hands into frying hot oil, or something like that. And what we do is essentially start self-associating ourselves with certain experiences that are judged as negative and positive by given agents. So I've fell off I broke my arm. I knew that was a bad experience. When I say you don't want to break your arm, you're going to hurt yourself. I'm associating my mind with your mind, my experience with your experience, and that gives me an indication of associated qualitative experience between agents. And so when I talk about, let's say, like a functional concept, something like being good or bad for me, I'm talking about in relation to the purpose of my life. So the purpose of my life, some people will say like, well, I'm an egoist. I do something which is good for me. I just care about my own pleasure. Or someone might be a Christian. They might be trying to express some measure of piety. There's different, different conceptions of the end goal. Now, what they all share, and what I would argue that they all share, is measures of subjectivity. They're all actually trying to achieve experiences, and they're all grounded in experience. And I would take the Kantian point is there is something being good or bad is, let's say, like 1 + 1 = 2 is something that we deduce via actually adding it up. But it's the experience of 2, or the experience of the distance between 2 points, which gives us the indication that is that this analytic process actually allowed us to create a form of knowledge. It would be the same when I talk about something being positive or negative or good or bad. It's actually the experience of pain and pleasure which facilitates the semantic content of that notion, of that concept. I can't talk about it until I've actually experienced positive or negative in that. So if like a computer couldn't talk about good or bad because from what I'm aware, it's not conscious of any negative or positive experience. And in that we...
Right.
Yes.
Earlier you said... Yes. Oh, sorry. It's just it's a bit awkward because I feel like there's a delay. So every time I hear like a little gap, I'm like, oh yeah, maybe I could butt in here.
No, go for it. Just interrupt us anytime you like. Anytime you like.
Yeah. Well, you said, you used the example earlier of like dipping your hands in boiling oil or something, and I would agree that wouldn't result in pleasure, right?
Yeah.
But I wouldn't tie that to like morality really. By my understanding of morality, I wouldn't say it's immoral to put your hands in hot or burning oil. Would you say that?
I would say that you have a responsibility to yourself.
Okay.
So when we talk about something like what responsibility is, what duty is, I would say that it would be when we talk about, let's say, something being right or wrong. You'd be like, well, what right or wrong by what standard? You know, do I mean that it am I breaking a law that God made, for example? But what I would say it's irrational. That what you want when you act and engaging in action urging process, you're acting in trying to achieve something which is desirable. You've acted on a part of desire. And by trying to bring around something which is desirable, if you bring around something which is undesirable, acting to bring around something undesirable when you're trying to bring around something which is desirable is contradictory and is irrational. And so I would see this all as, in terms of morality, I think that in terms of ethics rather, because I would say that it's probably not very important for this conversation, but there's a distinction between ethics and morality. In terms of ethics, which is being institutional, capable of being verified and falsified by the experiences of others, and our understanding of self, and so on, being universal rather than individualistic. I would say that when I engage in a certain sort of morality, I try to, express a given end that I've reasoned out. If I look towards our institutions and our society, there'll be notions of right and wrong based around conceptions of self, conceptions of good and bad in relation to the the experiences of others, and how we can best bring around those experiences for the greatest number of people. Now, people might usually go, it's like, why should I care about other people? Because it's most people usually understand why you care about yourself. It's like, well, I can't help but feel value experience.
Yeah.
So, like, my experience of good is good because, 1 + 1 = 2. It's the same reason. The semantic content of the word is actually derived from the positive or negative experience I have in my life. I can't dismiss that. But why should I care about somebody else's experience, right? Like, well, what is it about their experience? See, I think Hegel flips this on its head. He takes the individualistic position and says, look, your understanding of yourself, your understanding of the positive and negative experience is actually built from concepts which have already self-associated you with multiple other experiences. Like, I know that smoking will give me cancer. Why? Because I associate myself with the concept of humanity, of having lungs, and cancer being bad, for example. I know it can be painful, and all of these are self-associations. My understanding of self exists as a they, as a we, before it exists as an I. So what I have as self-consciousness is actually a cultural instancing of an explanation of human life. I describe myself as a single entity, but at the same time, that single entity, that I, is a linguistic construction. It works in grammar and syntax, allows it to function, and so that I can actually deduce different aspects of my life. It's not something that I'm born with. Which is why, and this is actually, in terms of the philosophy of language, there's loads of concepts which animals don't grasp. Just because they're linguistic. So, for example, it's quite hard to teach a dog, that if you take, like, if you've got a dog on a lead, and that they'll sometimes just run into into a lamppost, like the lead will run into the lamppost, and they won't understand necessarily that they've got to go round the lamppost to unhook the lead, because they don't understand the concepts involved between physical objects in that way. And it's like, it could be frustrating because you're like, this way, and then they just run round the lamppost again, and you're like, no. These are linguistic constructions, but moreover, so is our entire self-consciousness. And so when we talk about an egoistic position, like Hegel basically says, your ego, actually, your ego, your super ego, and your id are actually cultural constructions and explanations of how to achieve a good life in relation to and how to live your life in relation to the language and modes of meaning that have been built up by a society. And this is where I would say that there's two things involved here. There's the objectivity of judgment. The way in which we judge is objective, and even in terms of beauty. You said that music, it's subjective. Kind of. It's like intersubjective. So you find that, like, you might go like, oh yeah, I like this kind of music over that kind of music, but the concepts you're using to make that decision are actually constructions of language which are being applied to your experience. What do you mean by when you like something? What do you mean by dislike? The semantic content exists in your in your life, but the actual words themselves and the way the function exists in the syntax and the grammar of your language, which is socio-political, which is how we end up with things like beauty standards, and pop music or counterculture music, like alternative music, and we start associating ourselves with those different genres, it's not as clean cut as subjective, because if you want to read more into that, like, you can read into, like, for example, the Peter Geach, the Geach Frege embedding problem, and you can read into the Wittgensteinian private language. But in creating theories, like judgments, individualistically, it's basically not applicable. Subjects are incapable of judgments about themselves and about their own likes and dislikes without actually having concepts and modes of verification and falsification. Even around their own preferences, I would argue. But this doesn't make it obviously objective, because you're still relating it back to the subjective experience, right? Like, as in only the subject, that the experience of a single subject, which is what I would say makes it subjective. What we're really talking about is the preferences of one individual rather than the good of the collective, right? Or like some like foundational reality. Well, what makes something objective would be, let's say, the shared semantic content of the word, what we mean ontologically when we utter a word. And when we utter a word, I would say that it has to be grounded in a common experience for it to be intelligible. So if I couldn't, let's say you want to think of something which I had no access to. Let's say let's say like you are describing colors and I'm blind. I might understand the concepts and I could use them in words like language, because I've developed the grammatical capacity to engage with the language, but I wouldn't necessarily understand the semantic content. I don't know what you mean by green, or blue, because that relates to your experience from which I have no access to. Now, I would say in terms of our common overall experience and why we even engage with language, I'd say language is a form of equipment. It's used to achieve a certain goal. And we are all trying to achieve certain goals, which is why we've even bothered to engage with each other and try to formulate notions, like meaning within our lives. And all of this is tied to trying to achieve some manner of positivity, like to reach some sort of end goal. And so when we start talking about this end goal and this expressing our subjectivity, when I talk about something like value responses, like good, bad, right, wrong, all of these are common ontologically. If they were private, then we end up in what Hegel describes as a master-slave dialectic, right? Where someone proposes a notion of good and the other person facilitates that notion, says it is good, but has no access to it. So they can't actually say whether it is good or bad, which is why people can become, like, you know, if you've got like a pop singer, for example, that's got loads of friends who are telling them everything they want to hear, and it's leading them down a path of self-destruction. The pop singer might have been the one that planted the seed, and everyone else might just be agreeing with them, but it's still causing the same self-destructive behavior from which the pop singer would be better off avoiding if they had the knowledge of it. But they're incapable of self-knowledge because they're the ones that have constructed a hierarchical relationship with those around them. There needs to be a manner of equality for us to have any notions of cognitive success around and truth, or even around our own preferences and around our own values. And this is where I would say the objectivity of ethics comes in. The value of like the ontological, like the metaphysical grounding of a word such as good. If I say something is good and I just mean the positivity in my own experience, I can be wrong about that, not only in relation to myself, but I could be wrong in my understanding of it. And my use of the word can be wrong. And so, like the you know,
because you don't understand, like, why would that be wrong? Because you can't understand what would be positive to you subjectively. Is that what you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, I mean it's more complex than just like, it's more like I don't want to necessarily delve into the private language argument, but essentially Wittgenstein makes an argument which is called the private language argument, which is
I've heard of I've heard of that. So wait, like so you're saying that good and bad there are concepts of good and bad which everyone in the world can understand, right? That like they are actual, there is a meaning to those words.
Yes.
And I'd agree with that, but like some people would use the word good and bad in a way that sort of deviates from perhaps this true meaning, right? So
I would agree.
Like, let's say like there's a mafia guy and I owe him some money and I don't pay him, so he comes round and he breaks my kneecaps or something. Like, he would say, oh yeah, that's moral because Justice. Like he owed me money, whatever. Yeah, and then I would say, no, that's immoral because now my kneecaps are broken. So even if there is like a shared understanding of what good and bad is, maybe the mafia guy is using a distorted, like he's using a different word.
100%. So, and like the words themselves differ because of the ways in which we're approaching them, right? I completely agree. So this comes back to what I was talking about, like if we've all got different definitions of morality, whereas you say that we should. Oh, I can't remember what it was you said earlier. If we are using slightly different definitions, like the mafia guy is using a slightly different definition to what I would use, then I just can't understand how we can get objectivity from that. I suppose that's what I'm having trouble like understanding. So like the semantic content of the word would have some sort of bearing on the life. So you'd be like, oh, this is right because what you've done is you've taken something from me, and in taking something from me, you are deserving some form of retributive justice, right? But then I may go, well, no, this is wrong because retributive justice itself is fundamentally flawed. I mean, why aren't we? You should be trying to rehabilitate me. And you could question the foundations of each individual's position on justice and so on, and it leads to a dialogue, and it's in that dialogue that we start analyzing the semantic contents of what we mean and what we're trying to express. And the mafia guy may just look, it's better for me if I break your legs, and you'd be like, well, it's worse for me, so how can it be? How can it both be right and wrong at the same time? And then you may just say, well, the semantic content of this word is only in relation to my life. And then you would come out with something like the private language argument. And I don't know. I mean, I would love to see this happen. I genuinely would love this, just a conversation, they've just broken your kneecaps. And you're like, have you not read Wittgenstein? This is where like you start questioning the fundamental assumptions in which an individual's actually reasoning around, notions of justice and right and wrong and so on like that. And even the fundamental tenets of that reason. It gets even more messy once you get more into this. So, for example, Alistair McIntyre, who's a moral objectivist, argues that there, at least in our society, there are three dominant modes of rationality operating simultaneously around how individuals are thinking in terms of how they're actually reasoning. And one of the most obvious is in relation to the distinction between, let's say, liberals and libertarians in the United States. They have funnily enough, a common foundation in terms of the philosophical tradition that they're built on. Liberalism, actually, like classical liberalism, for the most part. But they deviated in terms of how they think. And, especially when you get into the philosophy of it, if you look at the philosophy of someone like John Rawls versus the philosophy of someone like Robert Nozick, and how they're arguing is distinct, and they're using different modes of rationality to justify their positions. But especially with I would say John Rawls's position, it's very self-justifying. You find that the rationality is actually presupposing a liberal notion of how to think. You're thinking like a liberal. You're also thinking like a libertarian. And this is one of the issues. And what he essentially says is that we need to start questioning our internal structures. This would be where you start getting into things like existential analysis. Like, wait, why do I think like a liberal? Why do I assume these things? And you start having conversations with other people and other parties, and we start like trying to, essentially have cross-cultural dialogues and so on like that to try and analyze our own personal bias, our own we'll have internal critique and external critique, and try to move through our, the issues within our own reasoning. And so it gets even messier, like even with than just like how you're using a word. It's like how you even construct words, how you think words should even be formulated in an argument. And obviously this impacts.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go too deep into.
That's the thing.
I'm already confused enough as it is.
That's the thing. But it gets really complex. But like it's not. And the question that you actually brought up, like the criticisms, one that is brought up in metaphysics all the time. It's what's called the open-ended argument, right? It's like, well, everyone uses good in a different way. If you use good one way and I use good in another, and everyone's using good in different ways, then what the fuck does good mean, right? Like, to put it politely. That's what G.E. Moore argues, right? And part of that is to look towards good being not something like, as essentially a measure of success, which is what the Greeks thought it as. Something is good, like the good knife is the one that cuts, Aristotle. When we talk about describing a being and its function, we can talk about, essentially whether it was good or bad in terms of whether it managed to achieve its function or not. And that's where the word good and the context of the word comes from. Whilst Christian morality and morality as it developed through like the Kantian sort of tradition and the Enlightenment and so on, started describing, good as a noun. It started describing good, especially in relation to God. God is good, and good become rather than a measure of something of some form of success. It became an object, which is why, if I say something's good and you say something's bad, how can it be good or bad? And it's like, well, it depends on what we mean by the function, the functions we're considering. And this is where Alistair McIntyre would reply that the foundation for all of this is the function of man. What we are actually trying to achieve in life and why. What is the good life? And asking this question allows us to see the objectivity in ethics. We are all trying to achieve some manner of positivity.
Isn't that also different for everybody, though?
Well, it can be different for everyone in certain ways. So certain people would see certain meanings and so on as good and bad in relation to the traditions they're from, which he would absolutely accept. But also the actual grounding for the semantics, the actual experiences would be positive or negative. It wouldn't be something that would be the actual experiences of an individual's life would be positive or negative, and that's what we're actually investigating. What will lead to positive and negative experience for individuals and for as many people, and if they were to apply this language, does it actually encapsulate the experiences of an individual's life? And if it leaves out individuals, then we could see that there is a contradiction in the way, a contradiction in the way in which our system works, which is essentially what the master-slave dialectic tries to show in the Hegelian terms. That if an individual has a confliction in duties, so for example, they're told to, feed their children, but also told not to steal, and they're incredibly poor, they have a confliction in duties, which is what Hegel would describe as tragedy. They are right no matter what they do, and so they're in a state of indecision because notions of good and bad no longer function within their lives properly, and so they can't actually decide without what to do in that scenario. Which is why it's up for us to work out what is right and wrong in that scenario. Ask the question, well, what do you have the greatest duty towards, your child or your state? Why? And so on, and move through things like that. And this is where I would say...
So you're saying it could be moral, if it could be moral for someone to steal if they do need to feed their kids. Is that
100%. I would argue that. Yeah, I would 100. I mean, like, I'm not gonna. I'm not like arguing that Aladdin should have been murdered. I'm not Jafar or something. Like the thing is that but to say that Aladdin, that the good state would be one that a good state for Hegel in this sense would be one in which thieves never existed because the confliction in their drives would never have occurred. We've managed to feed everyone so that they didn't have to thieve, or that they could find alternative ways of acquiring wealth to manage to feed themselves and their children and so on. And these are the kind of institutional barriers that have to be broken down, which is essentially where Aristotle was the first really to kind of propose this. He was saying, like, look, you can have conflictions within the state itself, like the institution of war and the institution of medicine. One's trying to kill people, one's trying to save lives. But this is resolved in the reason that we're engaged in this in the first place. The institution and the value of each institution is around the life of those individuals who are participating in the state. And the state requires both a military and a doctor. But then you ask the question, like, you can go, like Aristotle didn't, but you can go, well, why do we care about the state? Why do we not care about other states? And this is where you start breaking down, let's say, like, into what Hegel would say is like the value of consciousness, of all conscious beings, and what we consider is not just my experience, but the experience of everyone simpliciter. And that becomes like, the quote unquote God's eye view, where it's like God does what is objectively right, and it becomes the standard. But our notion of what God does, and what Hegel kind of points out, is that God is a constantly moving standard. Like, Jesus is the perfect human. Well, what the perfect human is changes from state to state. Like, it becomes better and better and better as we grow as people. Like, well, Jesus is never actually something that we'll ever achieve. He's just a standard from which we're trying to reach. And so, like, and obviously this is all very symbolic interpretation of Christianity rather than literal. And so, like, something like the notion of divinity exists in us as the standard from which we know we can do better and move towards. And so the objectivity of this isn't existing in a command given by God, but instead our own reasoning and our own rational capacities to understand that we could have done better, and the value of, like, rational hindsight. If I were a better person, this is what I would have done. And this is this is how we engage in ethics, I would say.
Well, so if you're saying that, like, someone who needs to feed their child, stealing is moral in that case, are you saying that because this person has a need? I'm just trying to remember the terminology you were using earlier. So, like, this person has it would be pleasurable for them to it'll be beneficial for them to steal because fundamentally they need to stay alive, or they need their child to stay alive. And now you're saying that we need to expand this to not only individual people but to everybody. So if we find something that's beneficial for everybody, is that what you're...
So, like, this is the whole thing. It's like in terms of, like, understanding, like, so understanding themselves in this scenario, like, they understand themselves as a citizen of the state, they understand themselves as a mother, you know, and these notions of identity are what inform them of how to engage in certain activities in order to achieve certain ends from which they would consider valuable. Now, what Hegel points out... Are
you saying that it's moral... Oh, yeah, sorry. So, like, if we're trying to decide if something's moral, we're trying to decide if it's beneficial for society.
Everyone.
Is that... Or not society, but... Yeah. Everybody.
Yeah, I would say that.
Okay.
I would say that's universal.
And so if someone steals to feed their child, that's obviously beneficial for them and their child, but it was not beneficial to the person that they stole from.
No, but that's the thing. This is why Hegel would see it as a confliction, where it's like no matter what they did, there's both wrong and right.
Yeah,
That's why it's a state of tragedy, because like the ethics has come to a halt, where it's like a straight linear process. The individual's in a position of indecision. Well, if I steal from this person, I harm their life and I harm their family. What ought I do now? Who do I have the greatest responsibility for? And Hegel says, like, look, like we can see that this is a confliction in what he calls the system of drives. You are being driven towards a certain notion of expressing your subjectivity in a certain way towards a certain notion of good. So is someone else, and so is like the entire state. The state is trying to recognize how to express the values of all of these individuals simultaneously to the greatest overall degree. And the way to do that would be to relieve the possibility of that confliction in the first place. For example, making sure people can, get jobs to feed themselves, or, that welfare exists.
Right.
And things like that. Like we end up with like welfare systems and food stamps and all that sort of thing.
But I mean, this confliction that you're talking about, like, it's would be good for this person subjectively, but not for that person. That's kind of what I feel like suggests that morality is subjective. Like, okay, if you say that morality is objective, is that because you're saying that an action that I could do either benefits society or it doesn't benefit society, and if it benefits society, then it's moral, and if it doesn't, then it's immoral? Would that be what you're saying?
It's like the content.
Makes it objective.
It's like the content of the words is descriptive of not only your experience, but of everyone's experience, of a common experience, right? It's not about private experience; it's about a common experience, right? When I talk about value, something being good or bad. Which is what allows me to understand my experience. Like, this is essentially, it's inside out. Outside in rather than inside out. I don't have a notion of value that I project outwards. I gain an understanding of the value within me from internalizing concepts, which allows me to evaluate and understand myself. Self-understanding and self-knowledge. And in that, when I, if I say your experience of pain and my experience of pain, or your experience of good and my experience of good, or your experience of bad and my experience of bad, if I try and use that word to say it only reflects my experience, then I'm trying to play a private language game. I'm trying to essentially play a game in which no other participants can play. And I can't know whether I'm interpreting and using the word correctly against my own standard. The interpretation and the use of the word become the same, and so I don't know if I'm right or wrong based on my own standard. So I could be doing something which is harming me and trying to achieve something which is actually trying to be helpful. In terms of the positive and negative experience of the individual in the state, the contradiction that exists in the state exists primarily because in both scenarios, there is a positive and a negative outcome for example, like Hegel would see it as universal mind or absolute spirit, he calls it. The language and the way in which we actually engage in trying to self-understand, being a cultural construction that exists in our institutions, is shared amongst us all. Ontologically, the semantic content is actually in my experience and your experience by definition for it to function. So if I was to say something is good or bad, like I stole the bread and it was good because I fed my child, then I'm also trying to make a claim that it was good that you got the bread stolen. And then you go, no, it doesn't. Like the content of my experience contradicts that. And the word stops functioning properly. And because the word's not functioning properly, Hegel would see this as a problem of reasoning. We have misunderstood what right and wrong is for us to end in this scenario.
Okay, so you're just saying that it's a bad way of using these words. If we're gonna be using them subjectively, it just results in a lot of confusion, confliction. Right?
Yeah, it's a conflict. Yeah.
Okay, so when you say that morality is objective, are you really saying that we should view morality as objective and we should use these words in an objective way, because if we don't, we're going to come up with conflictions? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, like the contradiction in the words themselves would prevent us from having any self-knowledge, and that would prevent us from actually having the means of even achieving a particular notion of good. But I would argue that there is no such thing as a particular, right? I believe that everything is contrived of universals applied and instanced individually. So like you're an aspect, you are an individual who is only really describable in universal terms. Like if I was to, I use your word, like I use the name Kai, and I reference ostensibly your experience, but then your self-understanding is going to be based on, like you're going to use other words that are going to separate your experience into categories, and those categories are going to be referential to not only your experience but other people's experience, so like you can go like, oh yeah, like I had a good time, and it's like, well, what do you mean by a good time? Or if you go like, oh well, I went to the cinema, and you're like, well, what do you mean that you went to the cinema? And you're like, oh, well, I went down the street. Like, wait, I even individualism itself is a form of like mode of understanding, is a fairly recent philosophical development. People used to understand themselves far more associated in terms of family. Like people used to be very much for example, someone, your father could commit a crime and you go to prison for it. In terms of in terms of like personal responsibility, it hasn't. It's actually a fairly recent development. Individualism is probably about like around the same time as capitalism. Actually, it started to really take hold at like 1600s. Sorry.
Like I don't know if because I'm getting quite confused now. I don't know if it's just like because I've got I'm finding it quite difficult to understand everything that you're saying. But if I'm understanding this right, it sounds like that you're saying that you hold this definition of morality, which is internally consistent and it doesn't result in conflictions or whatever, and you're promoting that. But someone else might have a different understanding of morality that is also internally consistent. Wait, would it be internally consistent if it resulted in conflictions?
No,
I
that
think
would be invalid. Yeah.
Okay.
But, I mean, this is the thing. So you got like validity and you've got soundness. So validity is just like consistency. So like if P then Q, P Q, like modus ponens, right? That would be consistent, but it holds no bearing on reality. So it we could say it's sound, but like we would say like an argument. I had to put in like you could have a form of modus ponens which is valid but not sound. So you could go, if I like I don't know, if Socrates is a man, then the sky is yellow. Socrates is a man, the sky is yellow. Well, it's valid, but it's not true. And that's the separation between consistency and soundness. The semantic content of the words, which would say like whether this actually functions in terms of inference, is derivative of reality, of its relationship to reality. And so when we use words like...
Is utilitarianism... Is utilitarianism subjective?
No. Usually not.
Okay.
Usually not.
And so utilitarianism is internally consistent, would you say?
I mean, I have my criticisms of utilitarianism. Like what?
Yeah. Well, what I'm saying is that like if there is these two opposing understandings of morality that are both internally consistent, then one could come to the conclusion that this action is moral, and the other one could come to the conclusion that this action is immoral. And then, to me, that sounds like we're talking about subjectivity in that case.
But you could have something that's internally consistent but not sound. So you could say like it's consistent, but it's not actually obtaining reality.
Okay, so you would argue that your version of morality is
definitely would, yeah.
sound. Whereas...
Yeah, I would, yeah.
Okay.
So I'd say it's not just valid; it's sound. It actually obtains truth value. So it's like, and this is, like the criterion of, this is why epistemology involves, like in terms of every field, like what do we mean by truth involves like, how we evaluate something being correct or incorrect. So for example, there are multiple different theories. So like I would say that there are I think there are loads of arguments against subjective. Like, so for example, subjectivism is tied into, like, for example, non-cognitivism, and then quasi-realism and norm expressivism and stuff like that. And then you've got, so like that. I mean, like, subjectivism itself is a form of cognitivism, which means that it's like, it's that it's actually like, to describe something as non-cognitive would be like emotivism. So like boo hurrah would be like good and bad equal boo hurrah. Subjectivism is typically associated with something being I like chocolate cake, attitudes, or something like that. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think that form of subjectivism bottoms out in a form of non-cognitivism, like in, like, the passions, like whatever. Like, because if you think that an individual is being motivated by something which is doesn't hold a rational component, and it's purely desire, then it's internal to that agent, and it's non-cognitive anyway. It just becomes boo hurrah expressed in more complex terms. And so the mental state itself, the subjective mental state itself, the attitude, is a construction from, like, your evolutionary biology, for example. So I think it kind of bottoms out in non-cog anyway. But that there's like, or like quasi-realisms, like, we talk about morality as if it is real in order to associate our preferences, to try and remove contradictions within our preferences, so that we understand, so that we can express ourselves in a non-contradictory way, so that we can talk as if it were real. That's like Simon Blackburn and what's he called? Stevenson. Now, I find all of those very not convincing, for one, mainly because I've got to also reject so for me to go, murder is wrong. They would say, I don't mean murder is wrong. What I'm doing is expressing an attitude, or if you're a non-cog, I'm expressing an emotive state. So I'm, rather than saying murder is wrong, I'm saying boo to murder, or I'm saying I don't like murder. And so I'm forced to, like, they would say that the meaning that is being expressed is not the meaning which I've intended to express, that an individual is incorrect for committing the action, but rather that I'm expressing a notion of preference. But it's like, well, why didn't I use the term that you could argue, like, well, why didn't I use the term I don't like murder? And then you've got prescriptivism. It's like, well, because you were trying to influence other people, and you realize that this is the more effective way of influencing other people. And it just seems to add more and more steps. If I can argue that if an individual is incorrect for committing murder, and that the reasoning that they are using is actually contradictory, it's either invalid or unsound, that they believed that would help them obtain a good life, and they were wrong in having that belief, or their notion of what goodness is contradictory in itself, then I can say that actually, yeah, murder is wrong. And it's wrong for the same epistemological reasons I would say, like, 2 + 2 = 5 is wrong.
Okay. Well, when it comes to, like I mentioned before, like, if I do something immoral, I feel guilty, and you said that's not a good indicator of whether something's moral or not.
I would say that.
Because I don't think through my actions in a logical way when I try to consider whether or not they're moral. I can't help feeling guilty if I've done something which I consider to be bad, for example. If I were to do an action and then think through it logically, and then come to the conclusion that it's immoral because for whatever criteria you just mentioned, like it doesn't cause good for, like, society as a whole or something, that I may very well come out of that not feeling guilty for having done it, right? So I suppose what I'm trying to say is, like, I don't feel an obligation to do what's moral. I feel an obligation to do the things that don't make me feel guilty. Do you know what I mean? Like
yeah, you're not necessarily moved to do rational things.
Push. Yeah. Like I can't listen to music that I don't enjoy and just think, I'm going to enjoy this. I've got my own sort of internal feelings and impulses which I can't help.
Well,
right?
I mean, like I'm one that I argue against determinism. For example, I don't think that necessarily. I think that you make your own decisions. But then, and I think that your understanding of yourself is part and parcel of that, and that the reason that you feel guilty is in part of this is I would say that guilt in some respects, don't get me wrong, it's not a totally bad, and like conscience isn't like, like for example, loads of Christians used to argue that conscience is the voice of God, right? And I think that they've got somewhat a point there. Like the notions of conscious and feelings of bad, like of unethical behavior, are internalized emotive expressions from forms of life and normativity that have been given to you as a child. Your parents have taught you, certain modes of understanding yourself in the world, and then you have an emotional reaction to them because you realize the harm you've done, and then that makes you feel something. On the other hand, there's times when, for example, I've done things where I've either done things that are bad and I've not felt bad about it, or I've done things that are good and I've not wanted to do good things. Like I've just oh fuck's sake, I can't believe I've got to do this. Fine, I'll do it. And I think that there's times when, like, for example, like I've helping family members I've had times when I've had to help family members because they've been sick or something like that. Now I mightn't be feeling great in myself. I mightn't. It's certainly, I know it's not going to be a desirable experience. I'm going to suffer a little bit. Like I remember having to push my mom through the snow in a wheelchair, and I was just like, I would have not wanted to be there. It was very deep snow. I had a pack on my back. I didn't want to be there. And the reason I was there was a sense of obligation and duty. And I do feel,
well,
I think
that's enough of a reason though. Like with that sense of obligation and duty, isn't that part of your desire to do it? Like you might say, I don't want to do it because
it's part
of
my desire
and I haven't got enough energy.
Yeah, I'd say it's part of a desire.
Yeah, but the fact that you feel obligated to do it is part of your, you wanting to do it.
Well, this is the thing. I'd say that like my wanting to do anything isn't given by nature. Like my wants, my like what I want to do isn't just given to me. It comes from my understanding of myself. It comes from my understanding of my culture, my understanding of the people around me. And so when I'm trying to express my desires, there is a nigh on infinite way of sublimating desires. Like in our society, food, water, and shelter become, like pizza, Diet Coke, and like fancy houses, right? The way in which we express our desires is sublimated through a normative framework which allows us to understand ourselves and understand what we are trying to achieve. And our duties and our obligations are just different expressions of that desire. I'm running through, in terms of ethics, conflictions in the system of drives. That means like everyone's desires are being sublimated in such a way institutionally to try and reflect what would be a good life for individuals. So when you feel like feelings of good and bad are not justifications in themselves, but they can be justified sometimes. Like you should feel guilty for hitting your sister. You shouldn't have done that kind of thing, On the other hand, you could go, no, this is an unhealthy feeling of guilt. You didn't do anything wrong. You just survived that plane crash, which is why we would talk about whether an individual was justified or unjustified for having that experience. But you wouldn't say they were wrong for having the experience, but whether they should, how they should reflect upon the experience and then go on otherwise. And the decisions that they should make after having it are part and parcel to this explanation. It's kind of like people who don't go and help their families should say, like, look, what are you doing? Why aren't you going and doing it? Why didn't you decide to make the decision which was less selfish or more selfless or whatever? And what I would say is that individuals sometimes don't know better, right? You get people who have unfortunately poor upbringings, not because of themselves, like they might have faced abuse and neglect. They might live in societies that haven't got developed moral concepts. There's so many things that are to be considered. And so an individual's obligations are obviously tied to their understanding, and their understanding is tied to the circumstances. And it can be circumstantial of whether an individual could have known better and acted otherwise, which is why we've got courts and justice systems to kind of work out whether an individual could have acted a different way. But in terms of the decisions that they've made, if they are given an option between one and, A and B, and they've chosen A rather than B, then they are responsible for that choice. They are responsible for the structures of meaning in which they've decided to perpetuate in their lives. And that's where I would say that in terms of objective ethics, it comes down to.
So let's take. I suppose what I'm getting at here is I don't really see the. Okay, so when you consider something to be moral or immoral, and you go through this sort of like logical way of doing it, like how many people am I benefiting society by doing this? Let's say, for example, like you don't eat meat, right? So you've come to the conclusion that okay, eating meat causes like suffering to sentient creatures or whatever. As soon as you made that realization, did it become like you felt like you actually just were repulsed by meat and didn't want to eat it? Or was it more like, oh God, I've got to stop eating meat now?
It was a realization, like I wasn't instantly turned off by meat. Like I wasn't like, oh my God, it's so disgusting. It was the realization that what I was doing was unjustified. That the pleasure of eating meat did not justify the harm it caused. It'd be like if I've got pleasure from punching people, it wouldn't justify the harm being caused to them.
Yeah. So, see, this is the thing. I understand philosophy to such a small degree. I don't even know if I can formulate my own questions. When talking about it.
It sounds like, if I may, it sounded like you were making an argument originally, almost like about Humean motivation, like our motivations. We are motivated by passions and not reason. Yeah. I just like, do we have an obligation to do what's moral, and why? The obligation comes from, like, for example, we already are trying to achieve some sort of notion of right. I would say that we are actually in a motivational process. We are an active process, and this would be like the will. We are already trying to achieve a certain end. And in trying to achieve a certain end, we're trying to understand what that end is. We're trying to understand how to achieve it. So I'm trying to understand what will make me happy, for example. I'm trying to understand what will make me happy. Or I might be trying to understand what is a meaningful life or a pious life or whatever it is. And, there are different explanations of how we are trying to achieve and explanations of what the good life is. I would say that the good life is, like, we are always trying to achieve some notion of goodness within our lives. And we have different explanations for what that life is in different, institutions. Some people are religious. Some people are atheists. Some people exist in the United States. Some people exist in Saudi Arabia, and all of which are operating on different notions of rationality, but all moving towards the same ontological grounding, which is the experience of positivity or negativity, or the expression of will in which individuals actually experience. And I think engaging in this, you could say that there is an abstract notion of right, which we do not know what it is, and that would be like the end goal of ethics. Like what God would do, the absolute ultimate great thing in which every scenario you enter, you do the right thing because you've got the perfect ethical format, which brings around the greatest good for everyone. And if everyone does it, we end up in what the Kant calls a kingdom of ends, where it's the greatest overall expression of goodness for everyone. And that would be the end of ethics. And we would all agree on that because we would all find ourselves within that. We would all find our individual experiences of goodness in that. We go, oh, right, this is good. And everyone would agree this is good. And so we would take it as epistemologically verified and free from relevant falsehood that it is actually good. It would be true, justified belief, free of relevant falsehood. Now, we don't have that. Not even close.
No, it'd be nice though.
It would be nice. We're not even close. We have arguments and wars, but that happens because of conflictions within subjectivity itself. Like Hegel would see this as a confliction within ourselves, we are conflicting with our own understanding of ourselves. So, for example, in trying to kill someone else, and seeing them beg for their life, in the eyes of that individual begging for their life, I may see my own monstrosity and the cruelty from which I am perpetuating. And it's a realization that, wait a minute, what am I doing? This is wrong. And this is where, like, Levinas talks about the ethics of the face being the foundation of language and blah, blah, blah. But essentially, like, in the resistance of a will against my own, it creates an epistemological relationship. They are dismissing my action as wrong, even without language. They are actively resisting my attempts to bring around a world in a certain way. And these conflictions are what we really need to discuss with dialogue rather than violence, because it allows us to actually resolve the confliction rather than perpetuate it.
Yeah, I to be honest, I might have to come back and watch this whole thing again, because I feel like there's so many things which I don't understand. There's so many concepts which just sort of go over my head. But I think I understand what you mean by morality being objective now. In that, if we're going to look at it from a sort of rather than looking at it from an individualistic scale, look at as sort of society as a whole, and you would argue sentient creatures as a whole, and see what benefits all of them. And then from that perspective, yeah, you can say it's objective. I suppose it all does just come down to what we were talking before about how we're going to define words, and the like, if something if you find something moral, if you've got is what you're doing promoting a form of morality which is objective, or are you saying that morality is objective?
I would, if you pin us down on it, I would say morality is subjective and ethics is objective, and I would hold a distinction between them.
Okay.
So I'd say morality is the individual's conception of right and wrong, and in relation to their behaviors. For example, like me trying to work out what I should do in my day-to-day life. And then ethics would be like the law, and institutions in which we come together and verify and falsify behaviors as justified or unjustified.
Okay.
So morality would be...
I mean, if we went to like a...
Sorry.
So in my mind, something like maths is objective, because, wherever we go in the universe, or whoever we're talking to, the logic is sound.
Well, here's the thing. And is maths objective? Like, so maths itself, the institution would be objective. That would be like ethics. But an individual doing an equation would be subjective, because they're using their own reason independent of the verification or falsification of others. So they might come out, oh yeah, 2 + 2 does equal 5.
Because they would be using different definitions of
let's say they are using the definitions, but they are just wrong because they're fallible.
Right.
So I mean, they would have to be unbelievably stupid. But like, let's say it was something like
they would just be wrong in that case.
Yeah, exactly. They'd be wrong.
I wouldn't say that mathematics is subjective because they are wrong.
But it's like when you start, let's say they started doing mathematics, especially higher order mathematics, and started abstracting and constructing new mathematical concepts, individualistically to solve equations, and they were doing it, based off what they already knew about maths, but were trying to, forward and better maths themselves. But then they're doing that themselves. That would be, for example, they could be right or wrong. They don't know yet until they submit it for something like peer review.
Right.
But the rightness or the wrongness
the
exists.
Mathematical truths in and of themselves.
Exactly. The same thing. It's like that would be the way I would define like morality and ethics. It's like morality in the sense that the way it's performed is subjective, but relates to the same ontological truth as ethics. I mean, like if you can even look at this in terms of Plato, the separation between a belief and knowledge really isn't just whether it obtains reality. Like if I believe, like for example, if I believe that 2 + 2, 2 + 2 equals 4. but I believe it not because I understand the actual methodology and the justification for that, or it's actually quite hard because that's analytic. Let's say I believe that the sun was a ball of burning gas, but I believe that the sun was a ball of burning gas because I once had a dream and it revealed to me that the sun was a ball of burning gas. And if people ask me, why do you think that the sun is a ball of burning gas? I say, I had a dream once. And the sun was revealed to me as a ball of burning gas. I could have a true belief, right? But then it's not a true justified belief because it lacks the methodology from which another individual could come around and test. It lacks like testability, verification, and falsification.
Yeah.
And that's where like I would say like the movement between something like objectivity, kind of in terms of morality, in terms of like what individuals do, in terms of their own investigations versus institutions. Institutions house knowledge. Individuals do what they can to better that knowledge, but then turn back to the institutions to engage in that sort of verification process.
Okay. Well, yeah, I suppose like it's. I want to have my dinner soon, so I think that's probably a good place to end. I'm going to be honest. I'm struggling to understand a lot of what was said today, but you know, as I said, I think I'm going to go back and watch it and see if I can get better grips over it. But yeah, I do understand now where you're coming from with them in terms of morality being objective. I suppose I'm just going to have to look into more what you're talking about, like Wittgenstein and sort of language, private language, and that kind of thing. Because I think that's really where my confusion comes from, is how we defining these words and yeah.
Well, the way that I think the best explanation, so Wittgenstein would say like that's self-referential. Like all these words are self-referential, but you'd say that about all words. Like we all have this same. So like the words we use in science, in maths, and so on. And you know, Nietzsche, for example, would agree with this. He would go further and say like truth is a currency. Everyone's trying to essentially put forward one notion over another. We're in a battle of egos, and the only thing that separates and science is actually just a development on the tradition of Christianity and truth seeking in that. And has nothing to do with reality as it is, because there is no such thing as reality. In terms of there is no such thing as knowledge, there is no such thing as truth, and we're all in and this leads obviously very, very nicely onto like aestheticism and postmodernity, as you can see, developing from that. And I would reject that. I would say that there is a reality and there is truth. We can be biased and misunderstand it.
Yeah, I agree.
But we do need to analyze, you know, our own why we're approaching words in a certain way. And what, you know, why we would engage in language in one way and not another. Like, why should I accept science over religion and its explanation of the creation of the world, and so on. And to do that, I need to see like what is the function of language and of knowledge and all of that. And I would say it's a form of equipment that I already am engaged in a process of trying to achieve some sort of satisfaction and expression of subjectivity. And whichever mode of life achieves that subjectivity in the greatest overall possible way, which can be proven, is the one which is objectively the correct way. And that would be the objectivity of ethics.
So could I try to just sort of like condense that down into one sentence to see if I understand it?
Sure, yeah.
There may be multiple ways that people understand good and bad, and multiple ways that people understand morality. But if we're using these words on sort of like an individual level, individualistic level, you're going to come up with conflictions and contradictions. But if we understand these words as pertaining to like society as a whole, then you're not going to have those problems. So you would argue that makes it a superior definition, and that's the definition that we should be following. That's what the word means, because it doesn't result in these contradictions. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, like, I would go so far as to say that it wouldn't be necessarily that we would just have these contradictions. It's that you wouldn't even be able to hold something constant. I can send you some links on like the Frege-Geach embedding problem and the private language argument after this, just to explain like why, if we use particular accounts and abstract knowledge from them, why we are incapable of like understanding the semantic content of words, and which would allow us to make deductive syllogisms.
I suppose Yeah, I suppose it just comes down to I just didn't know the definition of morality. You know, if I'm looking at this like, oh, what is it that I do that makes me feel guilty? Like if a mafia boss comes over and breaks my legs, he's not going to feel guilty about that. Um, then obviously he would consider that to be good. And if I was operating on that definition before, then of course it's sort of like music. You know, some people think this thing's good, some people think it's bad. So yeah, I think it's just.
I mean, this is exactly what Nietzsche goes on to say.
Definition of it.
This is, I mean, Nietzsche goes on to say as well. Like, look, like people are moving on these different definitions, not just definitions, but these definitions themselves have been constructed by political motivations and people's will to power, in which they're trying to achieve certain ends against each other. So the genealogy of morality, for example, of any given morality, can be traced back to certain political institutions and motivations in which individuals are trying to express their will, which I don't think he's actually wrong about. You know, people, a lot of the time there have been perverse incentives, and Marx even makes this point against Hegel, who I love Hegel, but Marx basically turns him upside down. Like essentially, people produce institutions produce people just as much as people produce institutions. You know, like people are told what to think, feel, and so on, and then you know, move on, be motivated by power structures and internalized notions of right, rather than actually having considered what is right themselves, and so on. So like, don't get me wrong, it's not clean cut and it's not easy. It's just I'd say
no, it's making my brain hurt.
Yeah,
I wouldn't say it's easy.
The objectivity of it, though, would be the experiential semantic the semantic content of the words of good and bad, of right and wrong. Whether you've actually, especially right and wrong. That's where I would really say, like, were you correct or incorrect for behaving in such a way? Like, and then like, you would ask, like, well, why did you behave in that way? And if you ground it all out in the expression of subjectivities, which what Hegel sees that as the end of, everyone's trying to express their subjectivity. You find that the greatest way to express subjectivity is a universal and not a particular, and that's it pertains to all of our experience and not just one individual's. So yeah, I hope that yeah. I can give you some reading.
Yeah, that'd be nice. Thank you. I think I will have to watch this video over. But yeah, anyway, thanks for the conversation. I'm sure, like, if I do have any other questions, like, I'll ask you. But that'll give me enough to think about for now.
Yeah, no problem. Well, I really appreciate the conversation, and thanks. And you know, I did think that, like, whether it was intentional or not, I thought that, you know, revealing a hoax to be a hoax, and especially the more complex, the better. It can be a very enlightening exercise for the population. So yeah, I thought what you did was.
Well, at least now I can tell people, like, all of the haters that I had, I can say, no, like, a moral philosopher has come out and officially said that this wasn't immoral. So I've got that on my side now.
I'm not the standard. I just want to point that out. Like, but yeah, like, I think what you did was cool anyway. So but thanks for coming on as well. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, nice speaking with you.
Take it easy, man.
See you.
Bye. So what did you guys think of that? I thought that was quite interesting. I'm going to do a quick Q&A for the next like 10-20 minutes. If anyone has a question, drop it in the chat and I'll do my best to answer. That was fun. I'm glad you thought so, Cacti. I'm not going to play Sekiro. No, not today. I have work to do. And I'm thinking about just moving like the streams for gaming onto me Twitch so that I don't clog up this platform, because I want to keep this quite professional. So I'll probably put Sekiro and stuff just on me Twitch when I decide to do that. what is your ideal road to socialism? I would say like market socialism, but it would be the enlightenment of the individual to consider non-self-interested actions. I think that the issue with economics is that it assumes self-interested agents as the bedrock for how markets will function, and I don't think they're necessarily wrong within our contemporary society to do that. The issue is I want them to be wrong, because people need to stop acting so goddamn selfishly. You know? So yeah. I guess the enlightenment of individuals, as Slavoj Žižek says, like the first act of violence must be against ourselves. How old am I? Take a guess. Does anyone know how old I am? Just had my birthday. Morality and uselessly hurting sentient being. Can you talk about the issue of morality for veganism? So I would say that the ontological foundation of ethics or morality, like in terms of evaluations of good, bad, and right and wrong, good and bad versus right and wrong, that an individual would be wrong to engage in a behavior which attempted to express their subjectivity with whilst dismissing the subjectivity of the other, namely any sentient being, because the foundation of subjectivity is only understood in relation to their in relation to a relation. It's only understood between the relationship of themselves and the other, of all sentient beings. So yeah, it would be like a contradiction. It'd be like trying to express subjectivity whilst trying to dismiss subjectivity. So yeah, I hope that explains it. 26, 29, 1. I'm 27, so yeah. Been listening to you as I built the display stand for a couple of katana swords. That's pretty cool. I do like katanas, man. I used to do Japanese jiu-jitsu for quite a while. I never trained with katanas though. That was very interesting. Each time you explain your system, it makes more sense to me in my understanding of reality. Oh, that's good to hear. I'm glad. I hope I get better at it. I'm trying to get better at it, and just use like normal people words. That would be really great if I could just learn to use normal people words. What does it mean to be correct? Okay, so like that's actually quite a complex question, right? To be like correct or incorrect. Like, what is the notion of cognitive success? I would say to have true justified belief, free relevant falsehood would be to have knowledge, right? So to be correct would be to have a belief which obtained truth value, which was a justified belief which obtained truth value, right? So if that gives you any real indication. So to believe that it's raining outside, a correct belief would be to see that it's actually raining outside, and you've justified that belief, and you could show why you would argue that the belief is true, like if that makes sense. And you could also say that it's free of any falsehoods. Like, for example, someone has put a TV where your window is, kind of thing. There's no reason to believe that. 43. Fuck you. Do vegan invent morality? No. Bozo C. Marxian materialism is the most fascinating part of Marx, although I'm not a Marxist myself. Carl insisting on materialism, indeed an emancipation of desire production, birth of libidinal materialism. I don't like the materialistic conception of Marx, but I think Hegel even understands the importance of material within the ideological, within the dialectical process. It's not like material isn't a fundamental part. I just think that Marx puts onto material sort of foundational ideological conceptions of material and expressions of desire more than Hegel. Like Hegel would or even like people like more ideologically involved. So for example, like Lacan or something, it would be like how you sublimate your desire, or like interacts how you would engage in society. Or like someone like Erich Fromm, Erich Fromm's a Freudian psychologist who talks about like advertising and like how we are actually sublimating our desires in our society. our understanding of material and the dialectical process is actually dependent upon how our society actually engages with material and expresses their desires in the first place. Which is why you can have a society which is, based more around things like piety, and notions of even trying to starve themselves and stuff like that, like fasting. You might see that having more material is an expression of subjectivity, but not when the expression of subjectivity might be limiting one's own consumption and so on. Karl Marx just come around in a time in which capitalism was really coming around, and industrialism, people wanted a lot of material. They wanted to have more and more. I just want to know from your perspective in philosophy, how does philosophy present itself as an externalization / justification for internal psychological experience? Well, I don't think I don't think philosophy necessarily tries to justify internal psychological experience, because a lot of the time it's very critical of it. It can really force you to critique your own psychological experience. Like, wait a minute, like, why am I thinking this way? So I don't think it's necessarily a justification of psychological experience, internal psychological experience. But I think a lot of people do try to endorse given philosophies because of an internal bias. There is a lot of, and in every subject, to be entirely honest with you, there's a lot of inductive reasoning. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. Definitely an illuminating conversation, PP. Enjoyed it. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I really am. The good part about perspective philosophy is is easy to listen to and teach philosophical ideas, unlike professors. You must be fucking high. Most people think I'm insane. I will say this. Some professors are unreal at teaching. I had a professor at university who was unbelievable lecturer. Some of them are terrible. Don't get me wrong. Some lecturers are absolute shit. But there are some really great lecturers. Like better than me. Sometimes I would like to think. Anyway, I think that's like one of my lecturers at Newcastle was unreal. He's really great, especially explaining Hegel. That's why I'm a Hegelian, probably, because I think he was just a really great lecturer and helped us understand Hegel so well. At least I think. But he wrote the book, like the philosophy of, like, a reader's guide for the philosophy of right. So I really feel like I learned a lot from his lectures and stuff. But then I really liked a lot of the lecturers at Newcastle. To be honest, I thought that the whole department's really great. From my experience of it, I would highly recommend Newcastle University for studying philosophy. I couldn't have learnt more. My experience of Durham wasn't as good, but that wasn't necessarily a reflection of Durham. But I was doing a postgrad there, so it wasn't the same experience as undergrad. So I was only there for 1 year rather than 3 years, and I was also coming from a more continental background, and they were slightly more analytic. But I did learn a lot. So some lecturers are really great, some lecturers aren't. Depends. But my experience has been pretty good to be honest. We respond to the polemic essay, The Oil We Eat, following the food chain back to Iraq. It gives a powerful affirmation of hunting as a way to opt out of ecocidal agrochemical system. Well, I mean, I'll check it out, man. I mean, you could just eat local fruits and vegetables, like, like, and the production of animal products is obviously most people, hunting couldn't sustain my population, right? Like, there's not enough animals in the wild. There's like 70 billion land animals killed every year for food consumption. We would have eliminated all of the wild game very quickly. I mean, shit, what are people in England gonna hunt? Fucking squirrels. But then there's also the harm that it does to animals, and the point of, like, ecology in the first place. Why do I even care about the wild? I care about the wild because it's a habitat. It sustains life and the life and value and sentience of creatures in the first place. Do you still have any contentions with the Labour theory of value? I do, but I haven't read any more into it, so I can't really add anything to me contentions that I already have. Because I find it justified that in philosophy itself is also vulnerable to this. Well, I mean, everything's vulnerable like that kind of, like, psychological critique is a form of philosophical sort of epistemological or even meta-epistemological doubt, right? What are the notions of cognitive success or not? This is kind of what Nietzsche was trying to really do when he was like, truth's a currency. So like it's not something that philosophy is blind to. I don't think. I don't agree with it. But I do think that people are a lot of the time biased and inductive. Hey, fellow Cancer, July the 17th, I turned 39. Well, have fun on your birthday, man. I don't know. I remember like a crazy lady on the bus, on the metro once, like talking about how I was a Cancer, and she was like so happy that I was a Cancer. But me girlfriend's a Sagittarius. I think she's a Sagittarius. She doesn't hear that. It doesn't matter. It's all nonsense anyway, isn't it? Like, but anyway, so yeah, anyway, she was like, you shouldn't get married, and she starts telling us how we shouldn't get married and how we should just be friends. It's like, I've never met you before, could you please leave me alone? Am I also a mathematician? No, not even close, man. Not even close. The philosophy of maths is interesting. I could definitely do with learning it, and I certainly could do with learning more maths, but no, I'm not. I'm sorry. I'm a mere philosopher. What would you like to say to people who dislike your videos or lives? I don't know, man. Like, people dislike, they're allowed to dislike it. Like, why? Maybe. Why do you hate me? No, it's like, I guess, like, what made you dislike it? And if there's like a justified reason, like if it's not just like I hate your face, or I don't like your accent, or I just dislike your demeanor or something, like what would have made the stream better? Have you got any rather than just leaving the dislike, leave a comment of constructive criticism, please. I would much prefer it. I do need to learn how to do this better. PP, do you prioritize sentience over intelligence? Well, I would say that like the value of intelligence is only in relation to sentience. Like, what's the value of reason and problem-solving skills if it didn't have any sort of value impact on our lives? Any sort of tangible experiential value from which we go, okay, because I've been able to solve this problem, that my life is better. I don't see any inherent value in intelligence. I almost forgot to ask this. You said that you believed in you believed in the sentience hierarchy in Insect Death video. No, I don't. In the Insect Death video, I was saying I don't believe in the sentience hierarchy. I never believe in the sentience hierarchy. In the Insect Death video, it should explain it. Like I would say it's the rule of double effect. We have to eat something, and because we have to eat something, we have to try and do it in a way that respects subjectivity to the greatest overall possible degree. And because of that, like, you know, insect deaths happen. It's not that I'm trying to kill insects. I would like to move towards a form of farming which killed as few insects as possible. But my responsibility to myself and my family and so on takes precedence over those insects. Not nice, but it would be the same. I even made this argument, like, you know, like Marty said, I think in our discussion, well, what if I had like ants in the kitchen? And I said, like, look, well, what if, like, I don't know, China or something invaded England or something, right? Which I don't think is happening, by the way. At least I hope it doesn't happen. Like, you know, would I be wrong for, or would the British military be wrong for repelling invaders or whatever, or vice versa, right? Because I'm not some sort of nationalist arguing for that nonsense or anything. You know, any form of imperialism or something. It's like, no, you'd be justified in trying to save and protect yourself. Like, it would be an act of self-defense rather than an act of non-consideration. It's not like that Chinese people don't have value or British people don't have value. It's that you have an obligation to protect yourself and your family, and in such you are forced to necessarily you know, maybe perpetuate an act of violence in that case, like defend your borders. It's like if Britain invaded China, I don't think they would be wrong for trying to repel and if I got killed trying to, like, you know, steal some Chinese person's house, like, look, like it's not that they were like, oh, look, like, he's a white guy from Britain, he doesn't deserve to live. It's more like the guy broke into my house and I had no choice. It's the rule of double effect. Can machines be sentient? I don't know, to be honest. I can't answer that question. I think that in terms of sentience, I think it's all going to fall down to a form of behaviorism from how we structure and understand what we would consider as autonomous behaviors. I think that when we see an indication of will, something which is acting in, as such as trying to achieve its own ends autonomously, in a way that appears conscious, which machines can do, we've seen machines be able to do that, then we are forced to accept that we have no indication of why we would dismiss them as having conscious experience. It's why like the Turing machine becomes so like tricky. Matter is an effort of mind in invertebrate habit becoming physical law. Who is that? Who are you quoting there? Almost seems like Hume. Or even like actually, that actually could be that sounds like almost even Sartre. Was it like there are I'm curious where you put the morality limit on hurting, for example, not walking on insects, because unlivable and very hard to achieve. Where to put the moral limit on not having a non-extreme life? I mean, it's possible and practicable. Like if it's like you wouldn't be able to function as a human being, then I can't expect you to live up to that standard, because it's asking more than that which is rationally achievable for a given individual. It may create more harm than good. It'd be like, it might be nice for everyone to give that kidney, but I don't think it's like donate a kidney or something. But in doing it, we might actually end up with harming more people than we're trying to save. And this is why I think universalization is important. Do you believe that truth exists, or there are established objective views of life, morality, that exist independent of an agent? Yes, I believe that truth exists, that there isn't, in which a description of reality would obtain truth value, in the sense that that notions of cognitive success, once refined, are actually able to accurately describe the way in which reality is. Or rather, accurately describe the ways in which we think, so that we understand what reality is and how we think about it. That's where there is only the self knowing the self, in the words of Hegel. Perspective philosophy, why do you think that there were several philosophers that were also logicians / mathematicians? Probably because it's a really closely related field in terms of logic and maths. Philosophy and maths have been very close for a long time. I mean, all you have to do is look to even like in the turn of the 20th century, like Bertrand Russell, like Principia Mathematica. But like, there was Frege. There was I think even like Gödel and stuff like that. Like what they're doing is just as much philosophy as it is maths. Is it at all useful to categorize people as good or bad people? Good question, Mr. Noodle. I think that it can be in terms of narratives, like whether an individual's life is good or bad. I think that in terms of a single act, an act can be good or bad, but an individual which seeks to achieve, commit bad acts like evil, it can be worth saying that this person is vicious and that a person is virtuous, and that it can give us standards to compare ourselves against, but it also can allow us to understand an individual's development in terms of how they are understanding themselves. Like an individual might go, what I did was wrong, and I seek to redeem myself, to make a recompense with society and reconcile themselves with what is right. So yeah, I think good and bad in terms of like a virtue ethical kind of conception of self can be valuable. It can allow you to analyze and better yourself, be a better person than you were yesterday, As I check and balance against internal psychology, then how important is psychology in the understanding of philosophy? Like how far do you need to understand one to understand the other? Honestly, it depends. I think that you got like philosophy of mind and stuff like that. It depends on what you're doing in philosophy. But I don't think that you need to do psychology to understand philosophy, because a lot of philosophers like myself are quite critical of psychology as well. So I'm critical of a lot of psychology anyway. Psychology has its problems. So you would have to, like, if you're doing the philosophy of psychology, especially, but it's all about argumentation in philosophy, like whose argument is correct and why, you know. Would you say that Marxist-Leninism is a science? No. I mean, it depends on how we define science. Science is such a difficultly defined word. But no, no, I'd say it's no. Just saying happy birthday, man. Oh, thanks, man. Grain-based agriculture didn't take over the world because it was good at feeding people. It was good at accumulating wealth for a powerful few. To be entirely honest with you, I think that I don't know. I mean, like, I think that's probably right in terms of even animal agriculture. So like grain is useful for feeding animals more than people, and that, like, it's quite cheap. Like cereals are very highly subsidized so that they can be fed on, like, used as animal feed and so on. So otherwise it wouldn't be valuable. And then without that subsidization, the animal agricultural business would be would be having to pay like stupid amounts for animal feed, which they wouldn't be able to sustain. And it's all ecologically, not ecologically, economically beneficial to a certain few group of people, which I'd probably agree with there. Hydroponics and vertical farming, yeah, man. But there's different like tomatoes, right? Like it's complex. I think that we need more empirical information on. At least I need to see more empirical information on farming methods and which one would be better for animal deaths. We are machines and don't have free will. Why do you think that? The real question is sentience mechanical? Well, this is the thing. I mean, like, is consciousness a derivative of mind? And I don't think that brains produce minds and necessarily. I think that it's definitely there is a connection between brain and mind. I don't know if it's straight up causal like that. So yeah. Building large factories does kill lots of insects, tomatoes, but there's also the risk of, like, you know, constantly, like, if you build a factory once, then the insects kind of get killed in one fell swoop, and then they don't necessarily rehabilitate the area, die again, for example. It's messy, it's complex. I don't know about AI having some inputs that we don't, and vice versa, in terms of, because artificial intelligence, it's not just about intelligence, it's about having experience, a qualitative experience when we talk about subjectivity and consciousness of that subjectivity. Like, do they have qualitative values where they're like, oh, like, this is a positive or negative experience? Like, does it cause them, like, pain or pleasure? Like, you know, that kind of thing. You can say there's, like, inputs, but it's also the interpretation of those inputs, the experience of those inputs. Maybe, I don't know if AI will have that. I wouldn't be surprised. Emotion is just preformed, underdeveloped thoughts. I don't know if I would agree with that. I mean, I would say that's like an internal stimulus, rather than necessarily. I mean, it comes with a form of normativity. I would agree. Underdeveloped. Sometimes it can be the most enlightening thing ever, right? Like, you investigate the emotion and you find the complexity within your unconscious to be like you knew something that you yourself were not conscious of. So to say that, like, to kind of put the unconscious as kind of like it's an underdeveloped thought. It's like, no, it might actually be more developed, and trying to understand those structures in which it's developed into is like the question in terms of psychoanalytics, man. Hi, Ninja Gaming. Oh. Joshua, hey man. Oh, right, no, it's tomato. It's a tomato. I say, yes, Joshua, I've seen you many times. Would you say you've committed harm by enabling a worm egg to hatch worms as they are going to die now anyway? Sounds very antinatalist to me. Circle of life, man. No, but I mean, like, if I could have acted in such a way as to prevent harm to a creature, then yeah, I've done wrong. Like let's say I knew that those worms were gonna be like tortured, mutilated, and die horribly, then yeah, kinda. Like, that's not anti-natalist. That's not just seeing life as inherently valuable in itself. That the experience of life is what gives grounding to the value of a life, not just it being a life. That the individual's trying to express their subjectivity. If someone's having their subjectivity constantly defied, then no, then it's not okay. It's like, I don't think that you're justified in birthing slaves, for example, just because it creates like more beings. I'm not like that stupid kind of utilitarian who just sees like increased amount of subjects as infinitely better, and we just need to produce as much as possible. I don't understand why you don't support a sentient hierarchy, because there is no reason to understand the complexity of experience necessarily given a higher qualitative experience. Like, a more complex experience might change value responses, but it necessarily doesn't change the value that the individual experiences. All values are experiential in terms of the respecting that subjectivity, in respecting the subjectivity of that being. It's trying to, it may have a more simplistic experience, but the value of that experience is always one. So yeah. Is more my lawn vegan? Well, this is the thing. Someone actually made this point. I mean, like, although I don't think that non-vegans are really considering whether they're, oh my god, I've just mowed the lawn. It's like, well, yeah, you're also like murdering billions of animals and birthing plants to then be cut down and then fed animals and so on. Is murdering your own vegan because of killing several insects? It's unnecessary and practicable. I would say that, like, I'd say that you could probably get away without mowing your lawn. I would say that, like, you could say that the harm done to you by mowing your lawn, by not mowing your lawn, could become, like, obviously becoming overgrown and liable to access your house and so on, but also like deteriorate the area, increase things like crime rates and stuff, which sounds stupid, but it actually does impact these sort of things. You'd be better off, let's say, putting down some gravel or something, so yeah, probably put down some gravel. Where's the limit? It's just like the what an individual can achieve. Like, look, in terms of ethics, in terms of perfection, there are high limits. In terms of standards, there are limits in which I would expect an individual to, institutionally, we would agree as being beyond reasonable doubt. So, like, killing. So, for example, we would say that it's reasonable to expect you not to kill someone, or it's reasonable to expect you not to eat meat or something like that. Is it reasonable to expect you not to cut your grass? not if it necessarily impacts the how you're gonna live your life, and attracts like rats and stuff that might increase like potential harm to you and your family and so on. But it is reasonable maybe to replace your grass with gravel if you can afford it. Do you know what I mean? That would be the limits in which I would expect duty to be judged upon. But remember that ethics is objective, while morality is institutional. It's not just about what you can hypothesize as being right. It's about what we agree on to be the actual right action in that circumstance. Which is why I would say like veganism it's a movement. It's an institutional movement based off developments of equality and welfareism, not an individualistic fancy. The Native Americans understood all things to be their brothers and sisters, and yet they still ate meat. I'm going to tell this to my brother, and I'm going to tell him that I'm taking his leg. This is how I live and judge my relationship with the natural world. Well, I think that's a shit way. Something's not valuable just because a culture says it's valuable. Something's not inherently valuable because it's traditional or something. Like, what are the arguments for seeing everything as my brother or sister? What do I mean when I talk about respect and respect for nature and so on? And then, would Native Americans still be, perpetuating perhaps these dated notions of morality 300 years on if that culture hadn't have been destroyed by Western colonial influences, and then people only express that culture in historical terms rather than taking ownership of it and expressing it in rational terms from which they could, accept or reject these traditions as being justified or unjustified based off internal logical standards, but also external critique. So yeah. So yeah, they ate meat, but they shouldn't eat meat. Just because they did doesn't mean they do. They should. That I don't think that's a good standard for judge your relationship with the natural world. I hate this whole like colors of the wind morality thing, like as being a justified. Like, look, like if I had the morality of, let's say I culturally identify with the morality of colonial oppressors, I can give smallpox to women and children because they're of a different cultural background, and I'm totally fine with that. Does that make it right? No, it doesn't. Tradition and history doesn't justify behavior. So you think that we should control all animal deaths, such as giving them the painless death? Almost everything dies a painful death. Look, like our responsibility is towards our own behaviors and actions. Like if something goes beyond my scope, then I'm not necessarily responsible for it inherently. Once that we do have the capacity to influence nature to a greater degree, then yeah, we should probably start influencing it to be a little bit nicer place. If we can give, animals a better life and a better death, then yeah, why wouldn't we, if we are considering them? I mean, back to I do like the lowest possible suffering for all sentient beings. That's cool. Although I do think that Zelnaga, the bacteria in your gut isn't, or your stomach isn't sentient. We need biodiversity in our agricultural systems. Some of the closest friends are carnivores. Who am I to judge them as compassionless or abusive? They are what they were made to be, just as we all are. No, like they're just like, I mean, like a cat or a dog is not a moral agent. You're a moral agent. You're not made to be anything. You decide how to behave. You aren't given instructions by nature. You aren't born with inherent knowledge. You're born pretty much tabula rasa, informed by your society what is right and wrong, and have means of deducing right and wrong in your life. Cats and dogs don't have that. They don't have morality. They don't have ethics. I don't judge cats and dogs as compassionless or abusive. I judge humans as compassionate or abusive. And I don't think humans can look to nature to find the how they are meant to behave or whatever, in terms of like some sort of divine fated understanding of reality. There's just no reason to believe in that. I think the grass looks better long. Just fighting the good fight there, cacti. Do insects have pain receptors? Yes. I disagree with how an ant. How can an ant value art? I never said an ant can value art. What are you talking about? Imagine two ants, same in the same way, except one can experience art. I say the ant who can experience art is more morally valuable. But why? What if it experiences the art and they're like, oh, this art's fucking shit. God, I wish I was dead. The art is this bad. Like, come on, man. Just because the complexity of their experience gives them a modified conception of experience doesn't make it better or worse, like, necessarily. For example, stoicism, an individual can become stoic to the environment and detach themselves primarily because they're more complex. You know, they're not necessarily defined by the pain or the pleasures of life. They might become like resistant to them, like Buddhists and shit, setting themselves on fire. Like, complexity of psychological experience doesn't necessarily mean higher inherent value within that experience, and the values and the quality of an experience is valuable against the experiencer, and the experiencer is what we're judging the value against. The individual's value of their own experience is inherent, which is why like these words have meaning in the first place, because I'm trying to value my experience and you're trying to value your experience. The fact that we value our experience is a necessity for what is the for this like common epistemological ethical framework, if you will. And value art. Come on, Josh. Come on. What is the difference between a vegan and a non-vegan impact on the environment? Assume we all go full vegan. Okay, well, like, we could reduce carbon emissions, or equivalent carbon emissions, by 28% if the world went vegan. So that's pretty huge. Oh, thank you for the donation. I'll get to that in 2 seconds. We could reduce our use of farmland by 70%. We would eliminate our number one cause of ocean plastics, which is detached fish and nets, which is 46% of ocean plastics. We would eliminate much of the farmland and the use of pesticides to produce crops to feed animals, which would overall prevent runoff into rivers, which causes ocean dead zones and river pollution. Number one cause of ocean dead zones and river pollution. We would reduce like the toxic what's it? It's like a vapor produced from like essentially like slaughterhouse facilities removing their waste into the atmosphere. Trying to think of other. We would remove our number one cause of deforestation. What else? Yeah, that's it off the top of my head. So pretty massive impact on the environment, man. Also, water consumption. Oh, number one use of water. It takes like 800 liters of water, I think, to produce a pound of beef. And we'll probably run out of water before we run out of oil, to put it that way. Jibab53 has super chat $10, and he says, how should vegans approach issues with diets as cultures of different indigenous groups without being perceived as imperialist? Ask them why they believe that that's justified. Like, there's no reason why you can't have a cross-cultural dialogue. It's like, I can ask, like, why someone believes in FGM and whether it's like justified or not. Like, or I could say like in terms of variations of punishment and justice systems around the world, you can have a cross-cultural dialogue without it being racist or imperialist. I think as well, when we approach this issue, we should try and like show the conflictions within the values. Like, you're saying that you value the animal, yet you're trying to perpetuate harm upon it. You're saying that it relates to some sort of spirit. Well, what is the spirit of the animal? And see if you can understand the metaphysics of what they're trying to express in that. If it turns out to be something that is self-justifying, point that out. It's an external critique. There's nothing wrong with that. If it's like if I was to say to a Christian, like, look, you're saying that God wants you to kill people, and let's say it's a branch of Christianity that argues this, like God wants you to kill people, but yet you say God is good. How can you believe that a good God wants you to kill people? And I make an argument that goodness is not understandable in relation to causing suffering and harm done to people, and yet they try to propose it anyway. I'll point out that that's self-justifying. I'll show them the foundations of their beliefs. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I would even say, like, in terms of indigenous groups, I very much argue that when you try to understand like an indigenous group as being incapable of taking ownership of their values, of critiquing their values themselves and perpetuating and bettering them, bettering alternatives or improvements of those values, of new ways to respect and engage with that culture and their cultural beliefs. So, for example, rather than praying to bear spirits and killing animals, pray to the bear spirit, draw a painting of a bear. I don't know, create totems of bears. Sacrifice flowers rather than animals, in terms of what Hindus move to from, in terms of their ritualistic practices. There are alternative ways of engaging in these cultural beliefs, in which you could say that is more consistent and justified, more right. And if it is their culture, then they have the capacity to do that. They have the ownership of their culture to do that. Now, if they say that it's not what they historically did, and then you just say, well, look, history doesn't define your culture. You do. If it's your culture, then it's your property. And if history's being defined, like the history of their culture was stopped by colonialism and imperialism, and they only understand themselves in reference to that abrupt cultural end or hindrance, then they are themselves reacting to imperialism and colonialism. They are not expressing their culture. They are expressing what happened to their culture. They are only expressing imperialism and colonialism. And their culture is then not theirs, but the property of the imperialists in their destruction of it. They've defined what their culture is by that interaction, rather than by the will of the people who are involved. I hope that answers your question, Jibab. Thank you for the donation. It's much appreciated. How long do you think veganism will become a norm in societies? Like, how long until it becomes a norm? I think it's growing as we speak. It depends on the society more than anything. Britain, I could see it becoming like standard norm by 2050. I would like to hope that's what the BBC said, but there's no way to predict the future. I can't really give an answer to that. My main philosophies are that I'm hot and sexy and free Britney. Free Britney, man. I can definitely get behind that. My God, like what's happening to her is weird as shit. That's not okay. Death to all of them. That was that. What's she called? Oh man, what's she called? I can't remember her name. Prime meme though. H3 Prime meme the hell out of it. Death to all of them. Everything we do influences nature, though, making long-term sacrifices by harming ecosystems in the hope of avoiding natural painful death of worms. It seems arse about face. Arse about face. I don't know, man. Thank you for the answer. Just got oh god, where'd that go? Thank you for the answer. I just got my copy of Singer's Intro to Hegel and look forward to learning more about idealism. Great, man. I'm really happy to hear that. Thank you for the donations. Much appreciated. I really appreciate it. And let us know if you've got any questions about Hegel in the future. Like, as I said, like, Tomato, we should really, before we start looking at our obligations towards nature, we should start really taking responsibility for our society and our culture and our engagement within it. We've got a long way to go before we can start thinking about even having the capacity to influence nature in a positive way, rather than just lapsidaisically, genetically modifying shit. Like, couldn't that lead to removing lions hunting antelope because it's necessarily painful? Then what's the point of them existing? I mean, you could say that. Like, I mean, some people argue for the elimination of predators if it wouldn't destroy ecosystems and prevent, like, you're genetically modifying predators so that they didn't exist. It's like, why should we say that why is a lion more valuable than what it's killing? Well, that's it. Like, I will not stop judging it. Who am I to judge? It's not a statement about judging. It's a statement about who, like, I. Well, like, yeah, but it's like there are, like, you could say that, like, who am I to judge, let's say, somebody else's culture? And it's like, I'm the same as anyone. Who are they to judge their own culture? Like, why can't I judge that culture? Why can't I judge someone else's culture? Why can't I judge my culture? Like, the reality is that all of these are forms of life and ways of being which are trying to achieve some sort of end. I don't believe in this who am I to judge, like, nonsense. We all have the responsibility to judge. Judgment is good. Judgment allows us to better our knowledge and understand reality in a greater overall possible way. And without external critique, I would be committing another individual to dogmatism because I'm too scared to judge them and their behavior. I hope to God that people are out there judging me. I don't see why we should say that the complexity is necessary for positive experience, Josh. Like, why would we say that? Presume that every meat eater has reason to every non-meat eater has reason. I don't know if that was to me or not. The plenty of reason to not eat animals, not just because. What do you mean? I don't know if that's to me or not. Are the indigenous people of every nation, or are indigenous people only in certain countries? Well, I mean, I think, to be honest, I think we're probably mistaken in talking about terms of, like, what do we mean by indigenous in the first place? Like, that's a contentious term in itself. Like as if the land, like a country is, like, orientated by who was birthed there first. Like, we're all immigrants, let's be honest. If we look at history, depends on how far back we go. When we talk about indigenous populations, really, it's normally in reference to colonialism. The term itself is referential to imperialistic and colonialistic history. Like, if someone understands themselves as indigenous, it's because they are seeing themselves through the lens of a history of colonialism in the first place, usually. Like, that's why you like for example, like, if you talk about a Native American, they're probably going to respond in terms like, I am, like, this tribe. You know what I mean? And that would explain, like, their identity in a much greater way than just saying, I am the person who is not, like, the descendant of someone who moved here in the 1700s. You know what I mean? It makes more sense to, if you're going to try to establish a cultural identity, to actually describe, like, to give the name of your culture a positive identity rather than a negative one. For a non-vegan like me that does not want to go deep and about ideology, how would you win me over in the most simple way possible? What's more valuable, taste or life? Why are you putting your own taste sensation over the life and interests, the most vital interests of other sentient beings? Do you not consider that selfish? I should probably bounce soon. Wendy Williams, was that it? I thought it was good, man. Like, death to all of them. I was part of creased at that. I couldn't, like, it's just like, ooh. It's fan class. Loved it. Top tier meme. It was like watching old H3H3 again. Like watching that, I was like, oh, it's like back in the good old days. Like I think H3H3's like picked up again. To be honest, I actually really like. It's nice seeing the like kind of the quality go up again. Almost. I mean, the quality's always been high, but I don't know, like the comedy almost went up. Can I be a vegan but consume animal products? Since the social and psychological struggles of being vegan harm my own subjectivity, how could it be that different from people who refuse living in the forest? In terms of like being vegan, in terms of like possible and practicable, I don't believe that. Like in terms of social and psychological struggles, I would judge them by societal standards. For example, we all do it all the time. We wouldn't say that an individual is right to be a murderer or anything like that. There are standards from which we expect everyone to achieve. And I would say that veganism is a rational standard in which we can expect everyone to achieve. That they dismiss, for example, sublimating their desires in one way and express them in another way, which is not only easily achieved in society, like there are substitutes in terms of economical substitutes, like you can go and consume vegan alternatives in terms of diet, in terms of clothing and so on. But it can even, it's not comparable to living in the forest in terms of the damage it would do to you as an individual. It wouldn't cause you the same amount of suffering, and that would be judged by a societal standard rather than like what we would see, like what we believe, what you are simply reporting, like, oh my god, it would just cause me so much harm. It would be more like, why? How would it cause you harm? What's so harmful about it? And actually benefit your health? You mean it would not give you as much pleasure? And I don't believe that passions and like selfish desires are the only motivating force. So I'm not gonna take that as an excuse. Completely disagree. Influence on nature happens just by breathing. Yeah, I agree. But like in terms of like that's not something that we can avoid. In terms of how we influence nature to overall like greater degrees, like genetically modifying nature, for example, is a greater influence than breathing. And it's one that we can avoid doing. So we'll have a greater overall responsibility to that. If you're talking about GMO, you're doing the opposite of encouraging worms. But I don't know necessarily what you mean by that, Tomato. But like I mightn't want to encourage worms. Anyway, I need to think about whether I want to encourage or discourage certain modes of life and certain existences, of whether it would be justified to perpetuate that harm on the world or can let it continue to happen, free from human intervention. No idea what the fuck that is. You misunderstood me. I'm asking if we can agree that the complexity of our experience is sufficient for more positive levels of subjectivity, but is not necessary. Well, I mean, perhaps. I mean, it could, but it could also create more negative, and I think that would be like existential crisis, for example. So it can create more positive or negative. It can create more depth and more complex experiences, but not necessarily greater levels of that experience. It might very well be that a worm eating, an apple has just the same quality of experience as, I don't know, me doing philosophy or something. what incentives would entrepreneurs have to start a company in a socialist society since they wouldn't own the means of production and workers will earn most of the money? I mean, you've already kind of distinguished entrepreneurs and workers. The whole point of a socialist society was that workers and owners would be the same thing. So the entrepreneurs would be more abundant. We would all be entrepreneurs. We would all be willing to start companies because we would all benefit. It'd be like, why would a worker go to work for a business from which they don't own? They only gain a proportion of their own, like the value they produce. You know, it's the same sort of thing. Like, what you mean? Why would investors invest? Well, they could be they could be given loans, for example. Like, so for example, I could loan money to a company which would be contracted to pay me back with interest, and that would still be socialist if it was a means of generating capital. I just wouldn't own the company. I could also, if I wanted to start a company and I believe in it, I could put the startup capital in and then have the business pay me back, and then even with interest, and that still be socialist because you'd be respecting my labor and the capital would be an expression of my labor. So yeah. Right. I'm talking about the ecological systems that we are required to plant for the planet to function. If you don't have verbs, we don't have soil, we don't have trees, we don't have everything dies. Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't disagree with that, Tomato. Like, I don't think we should fuck with nature unless we understood how it worked, like in detail. Like, I'm not pro GMO, like, without knowledge. Like, knowledge is power. I think that if we're gonna take it upon ourselves to act in such a way to bring around positive circumstances, then we should do it in the best possible circumstances. But we should also remember that inaction is a form of action. We are choosing not to act, and we are allowing something to occur. I think that our moral responsibilities, our ethics, are by and large more, more tied to our own actions and how we're engaging with one another right now, though. I think that this is all, very much far ahead, beyond where we are ethically. Okay. Thank you for answering my questions. Hope you have a good day. Yeah, man. You too. Okay. I'm going to bounce, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this stream. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing. Check out my course, An Introduction to Western Philosophy. And as always, try to gain some perspective.